The chemistry lab door slammed shut with a sound that echoed through Margaret O'Sullivan's soul like artillery fire in the Afghan mountains. At 54, with 22 years of Marine Corps service etched into every line of her weathered face, Maggie had faced down insurgents in Lebanon, survived Scud missile attacks in the Persian Gulf, and coordinated rescue operations in the mountains of Afghanistan. But nothing had prepared her for this moment when 17-year-old Chad Brennan's massive hand wrapped around her throat in the fluorescent-lit classroom of Millbrook High School. The pressure on her windpipe increased, but something deep within her military-trained mind remained perfectly calm. She had been in worse situations, much worse. As Chad's grip tightened, her thoughts flashed back to Sergeant Major O'Sullivan, the woman she used to be, the woman who had earned 2 Bronze Stars and commanded respect from hardened Marines twice her size. But this wasn't about physical confrontation. This was about something far more complex and dangerous than a simple schoolyard bully. The trouble had started 3 months earlier, but its roots stretched back 4 decades into the heart of America's Cold War secrets. September had painted the cornfields of Indiana in shades of gold that reminded Maggie of the sunrise over Kandahar province. She stood at the window of her small apartment above Kowalski's hardware store on Main Street, watching the morning mist rise from the Wabash River that wound through Millbrook like a lazy snake. The town of 12,000 souls nestled in the heartland looked exactly like the America she had fought to protect for more than 2 decades. Millbrook, Indiana, founded in 1847 by German immigrants who had followed the river west seeking the same dreams that had built this nation from wilderness and hope. The town had weathered the Civil War, sending 3 companies of volunteers to fight for the Union. It had survived the Great Depression by the stubborn determination of farmers who refused to let the land defeat them. It had sent its sons to World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, each generation answering the call to defend freedom wherever it was threatened. Now it was Maggie's turn to serve again, not in the mountains of Afghanistan or the deserts of Iraq, but in the corridors of Millbrook High School, where she had accepted a position teaching chemistry to the children of the heartland. The decision to leave the Marines had not been easy. After her 3rd deployment to Afghanistan, after watching too many young Marines come home in flag-draped coffins, after surviving an IED blast that had left her with a purple scar running from her left temple to her jaw, Maggie had realized that her war was ending. At 51, she was older than most colonels, her body bearing the accumulated weight of 2 decades in uniform. The Corps had offered her a desk job at Quantico, but Margaret O'Sullivan had not spent 22 years in the Marines to finish her career shuffling papers in Virginia. She had come home to Indiana, to the land her grandfather had farmed before the war took him to France in 1918. She had come home to teach, to pass on something more valuable than tactics or weapons training. She had come home to shape the next generation of Americans, the sons and daughters, who would inherit the republic she had sworn to defend. The Millbrook High School building stood on Elm Street like a red brick monument to American education, built in 1923, when the town was still prosperous from the corn and soybean fields that stretched to every horizon. 3 stories of solid Indiana limestone and brick, with tall windows that let in the morning light, and American flags flying from poles that had been planted by the class of 1943, most of whom had graduated into the uniform of their country. Principal Robert Harrison had hired her sight unseen, desperate to fill the chemistry position after the previous teacher had quit mid-semester under what the school board diplomatically called classroom management issues. Harrison was a soft-spoken man in his late 50s with the kind of gentle demeanor that had made him popular with parents, but ineffective with the more challenging students who had turned Millbrook High into something far different from the school it had been when he graduated from these same halls in 1981. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Harrison had said during their phone interview, "I'll be honest with you, we've had some discipline problems in recent years. Some of our students come from families with significant influence in the community, and that makes it challenging to maintain order. But your military background suggests you might be exactly what we need." What Harrison hadn't told her, what she would discover in the first week of classes, was that the discipline problems centered around one family that had effectively turned the school into their personal kingdom. Maggie's first day of teaching began at thorough 600 hours, just as every day had begun for the past 22 years. She dressed in the civilian equivalent of her service uniform, dark slacks, white blouse, and a blue blazer that concealed the service pistol she was licensed to carry. Old habits died hard, and the situational awareness that had kept her alive in 3 combat zones was not something she could simply turn off because she was now standing in front of a periodic table instead of a tactical map. The students began filing into her first period advanced chemistry class at 07:55 hours. Maggie stood at attention behind her desk, watching each face with the same intensity she had once used to scan for potential threats in Afghan villages. Most of the students were typical small-town teenagers, farm kids whose families had worked the same land for generations, children of factory workers from the John Deere plant that had closed 5 years earlier, among people who carried themselves with the quiet dignity of the American heartland. Then Chad Brennan walked through the door. At 6 feet 3 inches and 220 pounds, Chad moved with the arrogant swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His letter jacket proclaimed him quarterback of the Millbrook Eagles, but his cold blue eyes and the way other students instinctively moved out of his path suggested a different kind of power. Behind him came his 2 constant companions. Tyler Morrison, a lean boy with nervous energy, who looked like he was always ready to run, and Brett Collins, thick-necked and mean-eyed, who scanned the room like a bodyguard assessing threats. Chad chose a seat in the back corner, directly against the wall, where he could watch the entire room while keeping his back protected. It was a tactical position, the kind of spot Maggie herself would have chosen in an uncertain environment. For a 17-year-old high school student, to think in such terms suggested either exceptional intelligence or exceptional paranoia. "Good morning," Maggie began, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded Marines under fire. "I'm Mrs. O'Sullivan. For the next 9 months, this classroom will be your laboratory for understanding the fundamental forces that govern our universe. Chemistry is not just about mixing compounds in test tubes. It's about understanding how elements combine to create something greater than the sum of their parts. It's about transformation, about taking simple materials and creating something new and powerful." She paused, letting her eyes sweep the room, making contact with each student. When her gaze reached Chad Brennan, she found him studying her with an intensity that was unusual for a teenager. There was something in his eyes, a calculation that reminded her uncomfortably of enemy fighters who were assessing her as a threat. "Chemistry," she continued, "is also about balance. Every reaction requires precise conditions. Too much heat and you get an explosion. Too little and nothing happens at all. The same principle applies to life, to society, to justice." Chad's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Where other students might have heard a simple introduction to a science class, he seemed to have heard something else entirely, something that had put him on alert. The first week passed without major incident, but Maggie's military-trained instincts picked up on subtle patterns that civilian teachers might have missed. Chad Brennan never took notes, yet he consistently answered questions correctly when called upon. He arrived late to every class, but never late enough to face official consequences. When other students made mistakes or struggled with concepts, Chad would watch with a cold amusement that suggested he took pleasure in their failures. More troubling was the way other students reacted to his presence. Conversations would stop when he entered a room. Groups would break up and reform in different configurations, always ensuring that Chad was given a wide berth. It was the behavior Maggie had observed in Afghan villages when Taliban fighters were known to be in the area. The careful, fearful respect of people who lived under the shadow of unpredictable violence. The first direct confrontation came during the second week of September during a lab exercise on chemical reactions. Maggie had paired students to work on an experiment involving the careful mixture of acids and bases, a lesson designed to teach both chemical principles and the importance of precision and safety. Chad had been paired with Cao Yang, a quiet Hmong student whose grandfather had fought alongside American forces in Laos during the Vietnam War. Cao was one of Maggie's best students, meticulous in his work, and eager to learn, the kind of young man who reminded her why she had chosen to teach. The explosion wasn't large, but in the confines of the chemistry lab, it sounded like a grenade detonation. Maggie spun from the blackboard where she had been writing formulas to see smoke rising from Cao's workstation, the boy himself staggering backward with singed eyebrows and a look of shock on his young face. "What happened?" Maggie demanded, moving swiftly to assess the damage and ensure no one was seriously injured. "It was an accident," Chad said quickly, his voice carrying just the right note of concern. "Cao must have mixed the wrong compounds." But Maggie had been watching the lab with the same attention she had once used to monitor Afghan villages, for signs of insurgent activity. She had seen Chad deliberately add an extra measure of sodium to Keo's carefully measured solution, then step back just before the violent reaction occurred. "Mr. Brennan," she said quietly, "please step outside with me." Chad's blue eyes hardened, but he followed her into the hallway. The moment the door closed behind them, his entire demeanor changed. The concerned expression vanished, replaced by a cold smile that was far too mature for his 17 years. "You can't prove anything," he said before she could speak. "And even if you could, it doesn't matter. My family has been protecting this town since before you were born. We know how to handle problems." It was the voice of someone who had never been held accountable, who had grown up believing that power and influence were more important than truth or justice. But there was something else in his tone, something that suggested his arrogance was built on more than just teenage bravado. "Mr. Brennan," Maggie replied, her voice carrying the steel that had once intimidated insurgent leaders. "I've dealt with bullies on 3 continents. The uniform is different, but the character is always the same. You seem to think your family name protects you. Let me be clear in my classroom, the only thing that protects you is your behavior. And your behavior today was unacceptable." Chad stepped closer, using his height advantage to try to intimidate her. It was a mistake. Margaret O'Sullivan had been 5 feet 6 inches tall when she faced down 6'4" Taliban commanders who had never seen a woman in uniform. Physical intimidation was a tactic she had mastered long before Chad Brennan was born. "You don't understand how things work in Millbrook," Chad said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There are things about this town, about my family, that you couldn't possibly comprehend. You're just some washed-up soldier playing teacher. But I'm legacy. My grandfather built this place. My father runs it, and I'm going to inherit it all." He paused, studying her face with those cold blue eyes, "including the parts that are buried underground." It was an odd phrase spoken with the kind of emphasis that suggested layers of meaning Maggie couldn't yet understand. But her years in military intelligence had taught her to file away seemingly random comments that might prove significant later. "Mr. Brennan," she said evenly, "report to the principal's office, now." Chad smiled that same cold smile, but he turned and walked down the hallway with the confidence of someone who knew that no real consequences would follow. And as Maggie would soon discover, his confidence was entirely justified. Principal Harrison accepted her written report with the weary expression of a man who had fought this battle before and lost. "I'll speak with Chad," he promised, but his tone suggested the conversation would be more apology than discipline. "The Brennan family has been very supportive of the school district. Chad's grandfather, Patrick, served on the school board for 20 years. His father, Tom, is our current sheriff. They're good people, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Sometimes boys just need to work out their energy." But Maggie had seen enough good people in Afghanistan who turned out to be providing intelligence to the Taliban. She had learned that in small communities, just as in war zones, power and corruption often wore the mask of respectability. That evening, she sat in her small apartment above the hardware store, reading through the limited information she could find about Millbrook's recent history. The town's website was full of cheerful descriptions of annual festivals, high school football, victories, and civic pride. But between the lines, she began to notice gaps and inconsistencies that her intelligence training had taught her to recognize. The John Deere plant that had employed 800 people had closed abruptly in 2018, but there was no explanation for why a profitable facility would be shuttered. Several prominent families had left Millbrook suddenly over the past decade, selling their properties for far less than market value. Most telling, the obituary section of the local newspaper showed an unusual number of premature deaths among Vietnam veterans who had returned to the area in the 1970s and 1980s. One name appeared repeatedly in the historical records: Patrick Brennan, Chad's grandfather, who had served as mayor of Millbrook from 1965 to 1989. Under his leadership, the town had received several large federal grants for agricultural research and rural development. But there were no detailed records of how the money had been spent or what projects had been completed. Maggie closed her laptop and walked to the window that overlooked Main Street. The town looked peaceful in the amber glow of the streetlights, a perfect slice of American small-town life. But her years in combat had taught her that the most dangerous threats often hid behind the most innocent facades. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of a train whistle echoing across the cornfields, the lonesome call of the freight line that connected Millbrook to the wider world. It was a sound that reminded her of why she had come home, why she had chosen to trade her military uniform for a teacher's blazer. She had fought for America in distant lands, but the real battle for the soul of the nation was fought in places like this, in small towns where children learned what it meant to be citizens of the Republic. If Chad Brennan represented the next generation of leadership in Millbrook, then something had gone very wrong with the American dream. But Margaret O'Sullivan was a Marine, and Marines didn't retreat from difficult missions. She had accepted a duty to educate and protect the students in her charge, and she would fulfill that duty regardless of whatever secrets the Brennan family thought they were protecting. The real war for Millbrook was about to begin. October arrived in Millbrook with the kind of crisp mornings that reminded the veterans in town of better times when the rhythm of harvest season marked the passage of years and the future seemed as reliable as the sunrise. Maggie had settled into the routine of small-town teaching, but her instincts remained sharp-honed by years of scanning Afghan landscapes for signs of trouble. The signs were everywhere once you knew how to look. It started with the subtle things that civilian teachers might dismiss as normal teenage behavior. Chad Brennan continued to arrive late to every class, but always exactly 7 minutes after the bell, late enough to disrupt the lesson early enough to avoid official tardiness marks. His excuses varied, but they always involved helping with some civic duty, assisting his father, the sheriff, with paperwork, volunteering at the town library, helping elderly residents with yard work. The stories were plausible, even admirable, but Maggie's intelligence training had taught her to look for patterns rather than individual incidents. Chad's civic duties always occurred during classes where he struggled academically, never during study halls or lunch periods. His absences corresponded precisely with major tests and assignments, yet his grades remained mysteriously stable. More troubling was the way other faculty members reacted when she mentioned her concerns about Chad's behavior. Mrs. Patterson, who had taught English at Millbrook for 30 years, would change the subject whenever Chad's name came up. Mr. Rodriguez, the history teacher, would suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. Even the younger teachers who had no personal history with the Brennan family seemed reluctant to discuss the boy who was clearly disrupting their classrooms. It was the kind of collective denial Maggie had observed in Afghan villages where local leaders were collaborating with insurgents. Everyone knew the truth, but no one dared speak it aloud. The breakthrough came during her third week of October, during a lesson on chemical compounds and their historical applications. Maggie had been discussing the development of industrial chemistry during World War II, explaining how American scientists had worked to develop both life-saving medicines and terrible weapons. The same principles that created penicillin, she explained to her advanced chemistry class, were used to develop chemical weapons. It's a reminder that knowledge itself is neutral. It's how we choose to use it that determines whether we create or destroy. She had noticed Chad paying unusual attention during this lesson, his typical boredom replaced by sharp focus. When she mentioned the chemical research facilities that had been established across the Midwest during the Cold War, Chad's expression shifted to something that looked almost like alarm. After class, as students filed out, Chad lingered behind. For a moment, Maggie thought he might actually engage with the lesson content, perhaps ask a thoughtful question about chemistry or history. Instead, he approached her desk with that familiar, cold smile. "Interesting lesson today," he said, his tone carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. "You seem to know a lot about government research programs." "It's part of the curriculum," Maggie replied carefully. "Chemical history is relevant to understanding modern applications." Chad nodded slowly, but his eyes were studying her face with an intensity that was unsettling. "You know, my grandfather used to talk about the old days back when the government was doing important work in small towns like this. He said most people were too simple to understand what needed to be done to keep America safe." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. He also said that sometimes people who ask too many questions about the past end up becoming part of the past themselves. It was phrased as a casual observation, but Maggie heard the threat underneath. In Afghanistan, she had learned to recognize the difference between teenage bravado and genuine menace. This was the latter. "Mr. Brennan," she said, maintaining the calm tone she had used to negotiate with tribal leaders who held American lives in their hands, "are you threatening me?" Chad's smile widened, showing teeth that were perfectly straight and perfectly white, the product of expensive orthodontics that few families in Millbrook could afford. "Of course not, Mrs. O'Sullivan. I'm just sharing family history. My grandfather was a great man who did important work for this country. He believed in protecting America's secrets, even when other people didn't understand why those secrets were necessary. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. By the way, did you know that your predecessor, Mr. Jameson, asked a lot of questions about local history too, right before he decided to take early retirement and move to Florida? Funny how some people just suddenly realize they'd be happier somewhere else. After Chad left, Maggie sat alone in her classroom, processing the conversation. In the military, intelligence came in fragments that had to be assembled into a coherent picture. Chad's comments about his grandfather government research and her predecessor were pieces of a puzzle she didn't yet understand, but the pattern was beginning to emerge. That evening, she decided to pay a visit to the Millbrook Historical Society, housed in a modest building on Maple Street that had once been the town's original bank. The society was run by Harold Hal Stevenson, a 78-year-old Vietnam veteran whose weathered hands and thousand-yard stare marked him as a man who had seen combat. Hal greeted her with the careful courtesy that veterans often showed each other, a recognition that transcended the differences between branches of service. He was a small man, maybe 5'7", with silver hair and intelligent gray eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said, extending a hand that bore the calluses of both farming and fighting. "I heard we had a new teacher at the high school. Marine Corps, if the stories are true." 22 years, Maggie confirmed. 3 deployments to the sandbox, 1 to Lebanon back in the day. Now I'm trying to teach chemistry to teenagers, which might be more dangerous than anything I did overseas. Hal laughed, a sound that carried decades of hard-earned wisdom. "Teenagers are definitely a different kind of enemy. What brings you to our little museum?" Maggie looked around the small room, which was filled with the typical artifacts of Small history. Civil War photographs, antique farming equipment, displays about local businesses that had come and gone. But her trained eye noticed gaps in the timeline periods where the historical record seemed oddly sparse. "I'm trying to understand the town where I'm working," she said carefully. "Get a sense of the community, the families, the history that shaped this place. As a teacher, I think it's important to know the background of my students." Hal's expression shifted subtly, becoming more guarded. "Any particular families you're curious about?" "The Brennans, actually. I have Chad in my chemistry class, and I'm trying to understand his background. He mentioned that his grandfather did important work for the government." The change in Hal's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The friendly veteran disappeared, replaced by a man who looked like he had just spotted an enemy sniper. He glanced toward the windows, then moved to the front door and turned the deadbolt. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said quietly, "there are some conversations that shouldn't happen in public places. You mind taking a walk with an old soldier?" They left through the back door of the Historical Society, walking in silence through the alley that ran behind Main Street. Hal led her toward the edge of town, where the neat grid of residential streets gave way to cornfields that stretched toward the horizon. It wasn't until they were completely alone, standing beside a fence row that provided cover from the road, that he finally spoke. "How much do you know about Cold War history?" he asked. "Enough," Maggie replied. "I studied Soviet tactics and strategy during my intelligence training." "Why?" "Because what happened in Millbrook during the 1960s and 70s makes a lot more sense if you understand how paranoid everyone was back then. The government was convinced that the Soviets were developing chemical and biological weapons that could destroy our agriculture, poison our water supply, kill our livestock. They were probably right." He paused, staring out at the cornfields that had fed America for generations. "So they decided to develop countermeasures. Chemical agents that could protect our crops, strengthen our animals, maybe even enhance human resistance to biological attacks. Problem was, you can't test that kind of thing in a laboratory. You need real conditions, real people, real communities." Maggie felt a cold understanding beginning to form in her mind. They used small towns as test sites. Dozens of them all across the Midwest. Towns like Millbrook, where people trusted their government and didn't ask too many questions. Towns where the local leadership could be bought or convinced that they were serving the greater good. Patrick Brennan, mayor for 24 years, Hal confirmed. He signed the agreements, accepted the federal money, helped coordinate the testing. Most people never knew what was really happening. They thought the government scientists were just helping improve crop yields, developing better fertilizers, researching ways to make farming more efficient. "But you knew." Hal's expression darkened. I came back from Vietnam in 1971, and I could see that something was wrong. Too many of my buddies were getting sick, developing cancers that didn't make sense for men our age. Too many weird accidents, sudden deaths, families packing up and leaving town in the middle of the night. He turned to look directly at her, and she saw in his eyes the same haunted recognition she had observed in combat veterans who had witnessed atrocities. I started asking questions, started documenting things, and I learned real quick that asking questions about government programs in Millbrook was not a healthy hobby. What happened? I got a visit from some very serious people who explained that my concerns were unfounded, that my imagination was getting the better of me, and that it would be better for everyone if I focused on my own business instead of poking around in matters I didn't understand. Hal pulled a cigarette from his shirt pocket with hands that trembled slightly. You know what the scary part was? They knew things about me that weren't in any official file. Personal things, private things, things that could only have come from people in this town who had been watching me, reporting on me. Local surveillance. Patrick Brennan wasn't just taking money from the government. He was building a network of informants, creating a system where anyone who asked the wrong questions could be identified and neutralized before they became a real problem. Maggie processed this information, fitting it into the pattern she had been sensing since her first day at Millbrook High. And that system is still operating. Different generations, same methods, Hal confirmed. Tom Brennan took over where his father left off. Not as blatant, not as obvious, but the principle is the same. Keep the secrets buried, make sure the right people stay in power, eliminate any threats to the established order. What about Chad? Hal's laugh was bitter. Chad is being groomed to be the third generation. He's been raised on stories about his grandfather's patriotic service, taught that he's part of something bigger and more important than ordinary people can understand. He genuinely believes that his family are the guardians of American security. And the testing, is it still going on? That's the question I've been trying to answer for 50 years, Hal said. The official program supposedly ended in the 1980s, but there have been too many strange incidents, too many unexplained illnesses, too many convenient accidents for me to believe it's really over. He dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. Mrs. O'Sullivan, you seem like a good person who wants to do right by her students. But if you're thinking about digging into this, you need to understand what you're up against. The Brennan family has had 40 years to perfect their methods. They've got connections at the state and federal level. They control local law enforcement, and they've got resources that most people can't even imagine. Are you telling me to back down now? Hal studied her face for a long moment, taking in the scars that marked her as a combat veteran and the determination that had carried her through 2 decades of military service. No, he said finally. I'm telling you that if you decide to move forward, you better be prepared for war, because that's what this is going to be. A war for the truth fought right here in the American heartland. As they walked back toward town, Maggie felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had come to Millbrook to teach chemistry to teenagers, but she was beginning to understand that her real mission was far more complex and dangerous. The shadows were growing longer as the sun set behind the cornfields, and in the gathering darkness, Millbrook looked like any other small American town. But Maggie now knew that appearances could be deceiving, that beneath the surface of this peaceful community lay secrets that men had died to protect. The question was whether she was prepared to risk everything to uncover the truth. November brought the kind of gray skies that seemed to press down on the Indiana landscape like a heavy blanket, turning the harvested cornfields into an endless expanse of brown stubble under low-hanging clouds. It was weather that matched Maggie's growing sense of unease as she continued to probe the mysteries surrounding the Brennan family and their hold over Millbrook. The more she learned, the more complex the situation became. Through careful conversations with longtime residents and discreet research in the town library's archives, she had begun to piece together a picture of Millbrook's hidden history that was far more disturbing than anything she had encountered in her military service. The pattern had started in 1965, the same year Patrick Brennan was elected mayor for the first time. That was when the first federal research grant had arrived, a modest sum ostensibly designated for agricultural improvement studies. The grant had funded the construction of a small laboratory complex on the outskirts of town, staffed by scientists from various government agencies who kept to themselves and conducted their work behind chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. Over the following decade, the grants had grown larger and more frequent. The laboratory complex had expanded, adding underground facilities that required special excavation equipment and construction crews from outside the area. Local farmers had been paid to participate in crop enhancement trials, allowing government scientists to test new fertilizers, pesticides, and grow stimulants on their land. The human cost had begun to emerge in the early 1970s. Veterans returning from Vietnam had been invited to participate in readjustment studies designed to help them transition back to civilian life. The studies involved regular medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and treatments with experimental medications that were supposed to reduce the effects of combat stress. Instead, many of the participants had developed mysterious illnesses, neurological problems, and cancers that shouldn't have appeared in men so young. When family members asked questions, they were told that the veterans' conditions were related to their exposure to chemical agents in Vietnam, a plausible explanation that deflected attention from what was happening in Millbrook itself. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, who had served as the town's family physician from 1968 to 2015, had been one of the few medical professionals to recognize the pattern. At 67, she was a sharp-eyed woman who had learned to trust her instincts over official explanations. Maggie found her living in a modest ranch house on the edge of town, surrounded by the kind of carefully tended garden that suggested a mind that remained active and engaged despite retirement. Eleanor invited her in for coffee, but her demeanor suggested that this wasn't a casual social visit. "I wondered when someone would finally start asking the right questions," Eleanor said, as they sat in her sunlit kitchen. "I've been waiting for 20 years for someone with the background and the courage to dig into what really happened here." "Hal Stevenson gave me your name," Maggie explained. "He said you might have information about the medical aspects of the government research programs." Eleanor nodded grimly. "I kept records even when I was told not to. Every unusual illness, every suspicious death, every case that didn't fit the normal patterns of disease in a rural community. I knew someday someone would need that documentation." She disappeared into another room and returned with a thick manila folder filled with photocopied medical records, death certificates, and handwritten notes that spanned decades of careful observation. 43 Vietnam veterans returned to Millbrook between 1969 and 1975, Eleanor said, opening the folder on the kitchen table. Of those 43, 31 participated in the government readjustment studies. Of those 31, 18 died before their 50th birthday from various cancers, neurological disorders, and what were officially classified as accidents. She pulled out a series of death certificates, arranging them chronologically across the table. The statistical probability of that many premature deaths in such a small population is essentially zero. But every time I raised concerns with state health officials, I was told that the pattern was within normal parameters for veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange in Southeast Asia. Maggie studied the documents, her intelligence training helping her identify the anomalies that a civilian might miss. The timing is too convenient. Most of these deaths occurred within 2 to 5 years of their participation in the studies. Exactly, and there's something else. Eleanor pulled out another set of papers. I managed to obtain tissue samples from several of the deceased veterans during their autopsies. I had them analyzed by an independent laboratory in Indianapolis, paying for the testing myself. What did you find? Chemical compounds that had never been used in Vietnam, synthetic substances that didn't exist in the 1960s and early 1970s. Whatever killed these men, they were exposed to it right here in Millbrook. Eleanor's expression hardened as she continued. But the most damning evidence came from the children. She pulled out a third set of records, these dealing with birth defects and childhood illnesses that had appeared in Millbrook starting in the mid-1970s. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable: higher rates of learning disabilities, unusual allergies, developmental delays, and rare genetic disorders that shouldn't have clustered in such a small population. The families affected were almost exclusively those who lived in the areas closest to the government research facility, Eleanor explained. Families whose wells drew from groundwater that could have been contaminated by whatever the scientists were testing. Did you report this to anyone? I tried. I sent reports to the CDC, the state health department, even contacted some journalists who specialized in investigative reporting. But every inquiry was deflected. Every investigation was shut down before it could begin. Eleanor's voice carried the frustration of decades of watching injustice go unpunished. I realized that the cover-up wasn't just local. It involved people at the state and federal level who had the power to make inconvenient evidence disappear. What changed? Why did the testing stop? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring out at her garden, where the last flowers of autumn were struggling against the approaching winter. I don't think it stopped, she said finally. I think it evolved. She pulled out the most recent set of documents from her folder records from the 1990s and 2000s that showed a different pattern of illness and death in Millbrook. Starting in the late 1980s, the obvious experimental programs ended. The government laboratory was officially closed, the research grants dried up, and the outside scientists departed. But the unexplained medical anomalies didn't stop. They just became more subtle, more spread out over time, harder to detect unless you were specifically looking for them. Maggie examined the newer records, noting the careful documentation of cases that individually seemed unremarkable, but collectively suggested ongoing contamination or experimentation. You think they found a way to continue the work without the obvious infrastructure. I think they realized that the best way to hide a continuing program was to make it look like the program had ended. But the Brennan family's influence in this town has only grown stronger over the decades. Tom Brennan became sheriff in 1995, and since then, any death or illness that might raise questions has been quickly classified as natural causes or accidental. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where children played in yards that might still harbor chemical contamination from experiments conducted before they were born. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm 77 years old. I've spent almost my entire adult life documenting crimes against this community, and I've watched the perpetrators not only escape justice but prosper and gain power. If you're thinking about pursuing this, you need to understand that you're not just fighting local corruption. You're challenging a system that has had 50 years to perfect its methods of concealment and control. What would you do if you were in my position? Eleanor smiled for the first time since Maggie had arrived, an expression that carried both sadness and determination. The same thing I've been doing for 50 years. Keep documenting the truth. Keep gathering evidence and wait for someone with the skills and resources to finally bring these people to justice. She turned from the window to face Maggie directly. The question is whether you're that person. As Maggie drove back toward town through the gray November afternoon, she carried with her not just Eleanor's files, but a growing sense of the magnitude of what she was uncovering. This wasn't just a case of local corruption or small-town bullying. It was evidence of a systematic program of human experimentation that had continued for decades, protected by a network of officials who had turned a blind eye to suffering in the name of national security. Her military training had taught her to assess missions objectively, to weigh the risks against the potential benefits, to consider whether the objective was worth the cost in blood and treasure. By those standards, the mission she was contemplating was extremely dangerous, with uncertain prospects for success and the potential for devastating personal consequences. But her oath as a Marine had been to protect the Constitution and the American people, not just from foreign enemies, but from all threats to liberty and justice. The children of Millbrook deserved to grow up in a community where their health and safety weren't sacrificed to protect the secrets of previous generations. That evening, as she sat in her apartment reviewing Eleanor's documentation, Maggie heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs leading to her door. The footsteps were deliberate, measured, the kind of approach that suggested official business rather than a friendly visit. The knock, when it came, was firm and professional. Maggie looked through the peephole to see a man in his 50s wearing the uniform of the Millbrook Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Tom Brennan himself had come calling. She opened the door, but left the security chain engaged, a precaution that drew a slight smile from the sheriff. Mrs. O'Sullivan, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 25 years in law enforcement. I wonder if I might have a word with you. About what, Sheriff? About some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding your extracurricular activities. May I come in? Maggie studied the man on the other side of her door. Tom Brennan was built like his son, but carried himself with the controlled confidence of someone who had spent decades wielding power. His eyes were the same cold blue-white as Chad's, but they held an intelligence and calculation that his teenage son hadn't yet developed. I prefer to keep this conversation brief, Sheriff. What concerns are you referring to, Uwello? There have been reports that you have been asking questions about local history, contacting longtime residents, about events that occurred before you moved to Millbrook. Some people are concerned that you might be misunderstanding the nature of our community. It was phrased as a polite inquiry, but Maggie heard the threat underneath. She had received similar warnings from Taliban commanders who wanted to make sure she understood the consequences of interfering with their operations. I'm a teacher sheriff. Understanding the community where I work is part of my professional responsibility. Of course, Brennan agreed, but sometimes outsiders can misinterpret historical events, especially events related to national security programs that were classified for good reasons. People who don't have the full picture can draw conclusions that are both inaccurate and potentially harmful. He paused, letting his words sink in. I'd hate to see a dedicated educator like yourself become distracted from her important work by pursuing theories that have no basis in fact. Teaching is challenging enough without adding unnecessary complications. The message was clear: stop investigating or face consequences. But Maggie had faced down more dangerous enemies than a small-town sheriff who was used to intimidating civilians. Thank you for your concern, Sheriff, she replied evenly. I assure you that my focus remains on providing the best possible education for my students. Brennan nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her response. I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. O'Sullivan. I hope you'll remember that Millbrook is a peaceful community where people prefer to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. We've found that people who share that perspective tend to be much happier here than those who insist on stirring up old troubles. After he left, Maggie stood at her window, watching him drive away in his patrol car. The visit had confirmed what she already suspected: the Brennan family was aware of her investigation and prepared to take steps to stop it. But it had also revealed something important about their methods. Tom Brennan could have arrested her on fabricated charges, could have used his authority as sheriff to make her life in Millbrook impossible. Instead, he had chosen to approach her personally to deliver his warning face-to-face in terms that were designed to intimidate without creating an official record. It was the approach of someone who was confident in his power but also concerned about exposure. Someone who preferred to handle problems quietly and discreetly without drawing attention to the activities he was protecting, which meant that despite their decades of experience and their network of allies, the Brennan family was vulnerable. They had secrets to protect, and they were afraid of what might happen if those secrets were exposed. For the first time since she had begun her investigation, Maggie allowed herself to believe that victory might be possible. But first, she would need to gather more evidence, build a stronger case, and prepare for the kind of war that was fought not with weapons, but with truth. The battle for Millbrook was about to enter a new phase. The November rain that began falling on Millbrook seemed to wash away the last pretense of normalcy that had shielded the town's secrets for so many decades. As water pooled in the streets and ran in rivers toward the storm drains, Maggie couldn't help but think about what else might be flowing beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful community. The confrontation she had been anticipating finally came on a gray Wednesday afternoon, but not in the way she had expected. It started with Cao Yang, the Hmong student who had been Chad Brennan's target during the laboratory accident in September. Cao had been one of Maggie's most dedicated students, always early to class, always prepared, always eager to learn. But over the past week, she had noticed a change in his behavior. He seemed nervous, distracted, looking over his shoulder as if he expected trouble. After her advanced chemistry class on Wednesday, Cao lingered behind as the other students filed out. When they were alone, he approached her desk with the kind of careful hesitation that suggested he was fighting an internal battle between fear and desperation. Mrs. O'Sullivan, he said quietly, I need to tell you something, but I'm scared of what might happen if I do. Maggie set down the paper she had been grading and gave him her full attention. In Afghanistan, she had learned that when someone was afraid to speak, what they had to say was usually worth hearing. What's troubling you, Cao? The young man glanced toward the door, making sure they were truly alone, then pulled out a cell phone and showed her a series of text messages that had been sent to him over the past week. Stay away from the army, teacher. Stop asking questions about things that don't concern you. Your family came here for a better life. Don't make us change our minds about letting you stay. The messages were unsigned, but their meaning was clear. Someone was trying to intimidate Cal into avoiding any association with Maggie and her investigation into Millbrook's hidden history. Have you told your parents about these messages? Cal shook his head. My grandfather fought with American soldiers in Laos during the Secret War. He taught me to recognize when powerful people want you to stay quiet, but he also taught me that sometimes staying quiet is the same as helping evil people do evil things. The young man's courage reminded Maggie of why she had chosen to become a teacher. Despite his fear, despite the threats against his family, Cal was willing to do what was right. What else do you need to tell me? Yesterday after school, I saw Chad and his friends doing something strange behind the old Texaco station on Route 9. They were moving heavy things into the building, things that looked like equipment or supplies. When they saw me watching, Chad came over and told me that if I mentioned what I saw to anyone, my family would have serious problems with their immigration status. Maggie knew the abandoned Texaco station Cal was referring to. It had been closed for 15 years, ever since the highway bypass had redirected traffic away from the old state route. The building sat on the edge of town like a relic from a more prosperous era, where its boarded windows and rust-stained walls a testament to economic decline. Did you see what kind of equipment they were moving? Metal boxes like the kind the military uses to transport sensitive equipment. And there was an older man with them, someone I'd never seen before. He was giving orders to Chad and the other boys, like he was used to being in charge. Cal pulled out his phone again and showed her a photograph he had taken from a distance. The image quality was poor, but Maggie could make out several figures near the back of the abandoned gas station, along with what appeared to be military-style equipment cases. Cal, I want you to promise me that you won't go near that place again. If what you saw is what I think it could be very dangerous. What do you think it is? Maggie considered how much to tell him. Cal deserved to understand why he was being threatened, but she also needed to protect him from knowledge that could put him in even greater danger. I think Chad's family is involved in activities that they don't want anyone to know about. Activities that have been going on in this town for a very long time. That evening, after Cal had left, Maggie sat in her empty classroom trying to decide her next move. The abandoned Texaco station represented the first concrete lead she had discovered, the first physical location where current illegal activity might be taking place. But investigating it would require her to cross a line from passive observation to active reconnaissance, the kind of operation that could easily go wrong if she wasn't careful. Her military training told her to conduct thorough surveillance before attempting any kind of infiltration. She needed to know who was using the facility when they were active, what kind of security measures they had in place, and what exactly they were trying to hide. But her instincts as a teacher told her that time was running out. Chad's threats against Cal suggested that the Brennan family was escalating their efforts to silence anyone who might expose their secrets. If she waited too long to act, other students might be targeted, or evidence might be moved to a location she couldn't find. She decided to begin with external surveillance, using the skills she had learned during her intelligence training to observe the abandoned gas station without being detected. If she could establish patterns of activity and identify the people involved, she might be able to gather enough evidence to involve federal authorities who couldn't be influenced by local corruption. The surveillance began the following evening. Maggie parked her car in a grove of trees nearly a quarter-mile from the Texaco station, then moved on foot through the cornfields that provided cover between her position and the target building. The November cold bit through her dark clothing, but she welcomed the discomfort that helped keep her alert and focused. The abandoned gas station sat in a pool of darkness, its windows boarded up and its parking lot cracked with weeds. But as Maggie watched through her binoculars, she began to notice signs of recent activity that wouldn't be visible to a casual observer. Tire tracks in the gravel, fresh scratches around the door locks, and subtle wear patterns that suggested regular foot traffic despite the building's apparently abandoned state. At 9:30 p.m., headlights appeared on the old state route approaching the station from the direction of town. Two vehicles, a pickup truck that she recognized as belonging to the Brennan family, and a black SUV with government plates that she had never seen in Millbrook before. Chad emerged from the pickup truck along with Tyler Morrison and Brett Collins, but they were accompanied by an older man who clearly wasn't from Millbrook. The stranger was perhaps 60 years old, with the erect posture and careful movements of someone with military experience. He wore civilian clothes, but something about his demeanor suggested he was accustomed to command authority. The group moved quickly to the back of the building, where they began unloading equipment from both vehicles. Maggie adjusted her binoculars, trying to get a better view of what they were carrying. The metal cases Cal had described were clearly visible, along with what appeared to be electronic equipment and containers that might hold chemical or biological materials. The older man directed the operation with quiet efficiency, positioning the boys at specific locations, while he handled the more sensitive materials himself. It was clearly a well-rehearsed procedure, suggesting that this wasn't the first time they had used the abandoned station for this purpose. After 20 minutes, the group disappeared into the building through a door that Maggie hadn't even realized existed. From her position in the cornfield, she could see no external signs of activity, but she noticed a faint glow coming from what appeared to be a basement window that had been painted black from the inside. They remained inside for nearly 2 hours. When they finally emerged, the older man spent several minutes checking the area around the building, looking for any signs that their activities had been observed. His movements were those of someone with counterintelligence training, systematic and thorough. Maggie remained motionless in the cold earth of the cornfield, controlling her breathing and heart rate the way she had learned to do during reconnaissance missions in Afghanistan. The stranger's inspection came uncomfortably close to her position, but her camouflage and stillness kept her hidden. After the vehicles departed, Maggie waited another hour before moving closer to the building. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions about what was happening in Millbrook. The basement window that had shown the faint glow was protected by steel bars that looked new despite the building's abandoned appearance. When she knelt beside it and listened carefully, she could hear the sound of electronic equipment humming inside, the kind of steady background noise that suggested sophisticated machinery was operating in the underground space. More disturbing was what she found when she circled the building looking for other points of entry. Behind the station, partially concealed by overgrown weeds, was a metal hatch that provided access to what appeared to be an extensive underground facility. The hatch was secured with a military-grade lock and surrounded by subtle security measures that would have been invisible to civilian eyes. As she knelt beside the hatch, examining the lock mechanism and trying to estimate the size of the underground complex, Maggie realized that she had stumbled onto something far more significant than local corruption or small-town bullying. The abandoned Texaco station was being used as a front for an active government operation, one that involved the same families who had been running illegal experiments in Millbrook for more than 40 years. But her moment of discovery became a moment of crisis when she heard the sound of approaching vehicles on the old state route. Two sets of headlights were moving toward the station much faster than the earlier arrival had been, suggesting that someone had detected her presence and was responding to a security breach. Maggie had perhaps 30 seconds to reach the cover of the cornfield before the vehicles arrived. She moved with the speed and stealth that had kept her alive in combat zones, but she knew that her surveillance operation had been compromised. Worse, she now had to assume that the people she was investigating were aware of her interest in their activities. As she lay hidden in the darkness, watching the security team search the area around the building with military precision, Maggie realized that the conflict she had been anticipating was about to begin in earnest. The Brennan family and their allies had moved beyond warnings and intimidation. They were now treating her as an active threat to their operations. The war for the truth about Millbrook was no longer a possibility. It was a reality, and she was now officially behind enemy lines. But Margaret O'Sullivan was a Marine trained to operate in hostile territory and equipped with 22 years of experience in asymmetric warfare. If the enemy wanted a fight, she would give them one they would never forget. The question was whether she could uncover their secrets and expose their crimes before they found a way to silence her permanently. As the security team finally abandoned their search and disappeared back into the underground facility, Maggie began planning her next move. She had confirmation that illegal activities were taking place, but she needed more specific evidence before she could approach federal authorities who might be trustworthy. That meant she would have to find a way inside the underground complex to document whatever was happening beneath the abandoned Texaco station. It was the kind of mission that could easily end in capture or death, but it was also the only way to gather the evidence needed to bring justice to Millbrook. The November wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of winter. As Maggie made her way back through the cornfields toward her car, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had sworn an oath to protect the American people from all enemies, foreign and domestic. The fact that the enemies in Millbrook wore the masks of respectability and claimed to be acting in the name of national security didn't change her duty. The real battle was about to begin. December arrived in Millbrook with a kind of bitter cold that seemed to freeze not just the landscape but time itself, trapping the town in a perpetual twilight between the promises of Christmas and the harsh reality of winter. For Maggie O'Sullivan, the shortened days and longer nights provided the cover she needed for the most dangerous phase of her investigation. The week following her surveillance of the abandoned Texaco station had been a careful dance of normal routine and covert preparation. She continued teaching her chemistry classes, maintaining the facade of a dedicated educator, while secretly planning an operation that would make her nighttime reconnaissance look like a casual stroll. But first, she needed allies she could trust with her life. The call came on a Thursday evening, 3 days before she planned to attempt infiltration of the underground facility. Harold Stevenson's voice on the phone carried an urgency she hadn't heard before. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, you need to come to the Historical Society tonight and come through the back entrance." Maggie found Hal waiting for her in the darkened building, along with two people she hadn't expected to see. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell sat at the small conference table, her medical files spread out before her like evidence in a war crimes tribunal. Beside her was a man Maggie didn't recognize, perhaps 70 years old with intelligent eyes and the careful posture of someone who had learned to watch for threats. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," Hal said quietly, "I'd like you to meet James Kowalski." Jimmy's father was one of the scientists who worked on the original government programs here in Millbrook. But Jimmy Kowalski extended a weathered hand, studying Maggie's face with the intensity of someone making a crucial decision. "My father was Stefan Kowalski, a Polish refugee who came to America after the war. The government recruited him to work on chemical research projects, told him he would be helping to protect his new country from Soviet threats." He paused, and Maggie could see decades of pain and guilt in his expression. What they didn't tell him was that the research would involve experimenting on American citizens. When he discovered the truth, he tried to stop the program. That decision cost him everything. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades documenting atrocities. "Stefan Kowalski was murdered in 1987, officially listed as a suicide, but I was the physician who examined his body. The wound patterns were inconsistent with a self-inflicted gunshot. Someone executed him to keep him quiet." Jimmy nodded grimly. "My father had been secretly documenting everything he was forced to do, keeping detailed records of the experiments, the test subjects, the results. He hid those records before they killed him, and I've spent the last 35 years trying to find them." "Did you?" Maggie asked. "2 days ago," Jimmy replied, pulling a metal case from beneath the table. "I finally located his emergency cache, hidden in a place only I would think to look. What I found there is going to change everything we thought we knew about Millbrook." He opened the case to reveal hundreds of documents, photographs, and film canisters that had been carefully preserved for more than 3 decades. The papers were covered with handwriting in multiple languages, scientific formulas, and detailed diagrams of chemical compounds and biological agents. "My father was forced to develop weapons," Jimmy explained. "Not just chemical agents for use against enemy soldiers, but substances designed to alter human behavior, enhance physical capabilities, and create long-term genetic modifications that could be passed down through generations." Eleanor spread out some of the photographs, and Maggie felt her stomach clench as she recognized what she was seeing. Laboratory subjects in various stages of physical transformation, some appearing enhanced, while others showed obvious signs of severe illness or mutation. The early experiments were crude. Eleanor said, her medical training helping her interpret the horrific images. They were trying to create super soldiers, people with enhanced strength, speed, and endurance. But they didn't understand the biological mechanisms well enough to control the results. "How many test subjects were there?" "Hundreds," Jimmy replied. "Volunteers from the military veterans who were told they were receiving experimental treatments for combat injuries, even civilian volunteers who thought they were participating in medical research that would benefit mankind." Hal pointed to a series of documents that showed names and addresses throughout the Midwest. It wasn't just Millbrook. They had facilities in 12 different towns, all connected by an underground network that allowed them to transfer subjects, share research data, and coordinate experiments across multiple locations. But Millbrook was the central hub, Eleanor added. This is where they conducted the most advanced research, where they tried to perfect the formulas that would create reliable, controllable enhancements. Maggie studied the documents, her intelligence training, helping her identify the organizational structure and chain of command that had overseen these atrocities. Who was running the program? Officially, it was classified above my father's clearance level, Jimmy said. But he managed to identify several key figures through careful observation and document analysis. He pulled out a photograph that showed a group of men in military uniforms standing outside what appeared to be the underground facility beneath the Texaco station. The image was dated 1975, but one of the faces was unmistakably familiar. Patrick Brennan wasn't just the mayor who provided local cooperation, Jimmy explained. He was an active participant in the research program, someone who helped select test subjects and coordinate with federal agencies. Eleanor pointed to another figure in the photograph. And this man, Dr. Marcus Webb, was the lead scientist. According to Stefan's notes, Webb was a brilliant chemist who had no ethical constraints about human experimentation. He viewed the test subjects as raw material for his research. Is Webb still alive? Unknown, Hal replied. He disappeared in 1987, the same year Stefan was murdered. Officially, he retired from government service and moved to Europe. But there's no record of him after that. Jimmy pulled out another set of documents, these more recent and bearing classification stamps from the 1990s and 2000s. The program didn't end in the 1980s like everyone believes. According to my father's analysis, they simply moved it deeper underground and made it more sophisticated. More sophisticated how? Instead of crude experiments on adult volunteers, they began working with genetic modification of reproductive cells. They developed ways to alter human DNA that would be passed down through generations, creating enhanced bloodlines that would appear completely natural. Eleanor's expression was grim as she confirmed Jimmy's explanation. I've been tracking unusual birth patterns in Millbrook for decades. Children with exceptional physical and mental capabilities, but also children with genetic abnormalities that shouldn't exist in nature. The modern program appears to be focused on creating a genetically enhanced population that looks normal, but possesses capabilities far beyond baseline human parameters. Maggie felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Chad Brennan, third generation, Hal confirmed. His grandfather was involved in selecting the original test subjects. His father helped cover up the crimes and maintain the secrecy. Chad himself appears to be the product of genetic enhancement raised from birth to continue the family's role in protecting the program. Which brings us to why we're having this conversation tonight, Jimmy said, his expression becoming even more serious. According to my father's notes, the underground facility beneath the Texaco station is just the tip of the iceberg. The real research complex extends for miles underground, connecting to facilities beneath other buildings throughout Millbrook. He pulled out a hand-drawn map that showed an extensive network of tunnels, laboratories, and storage areas that honeycombed the ground beneath the town. If we're going to expose this program and bring the people responsible to justice, we need concrete evidence from inside those facilities. We need photographs, documents, maybe even biological samples that can be independently analyzed. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying Maggie with the careful assessment of a medical professional. Mrs. O'Sullivan, we're asking you to undertake a mission that's extremely dangerous. These people have been killing to protect their secrets for 40 years. If you're caught inside their facility, you won't be given a chance to explain your presence. What about going to federal authorities with the evidence we already have? We've tried that, Hal said bitterly. Every time someone has attempted to expose this program, the investigation gets shut down by people with connections at the highest levels of government. This isn't just local corruption. This is a conspiracy that involves elements of the intelligence community, the military and civilian agencies that have been protecting this research for decades. Jimmy nodded in agreement. The only way to break through that protection is to gather evidence that's so compelling, so undeniable, that it can't be suppressed or discredited. We need proof that will force congressional hearings, independent investigations, and criminal prosecutions that can't be stopped by bureaucratic interference. Maggie looked around the table at the three people who had devoted decades of their lives to seeking justice for the victims of Millbrook's hidden atrocities. They were asking her to risk everything on a mission that might be the only chance to expose crimes that had been covered up for nearly half a century. But she was a Marine trained to undertake dangerous missions in service of a higher cause. If she could gather the evidence needed to bring these criminals to justice, She might be able to save future generations from becoming victims of their twisted research. What kind of support can you provide? Eleanor smiled for the first time that evening. More than you might expect. I still have contacts in the medical community who can provide independent analysis of any biological evidence you obtain. Jimmy has detailed knowledge of the facility layout based on his father's documentation. And Hal has been mapping the modern security systems for the past 5 years. Security systems? Hal pulled out a folder containing surveillance photographs and technical diagrams. The underground complex is protected by state-of-the-art sensors, cameras, and automated defense systems. But they're designed to detect conventional intrusion attempts. Someone with military training who understands their weaknesses might be able to penetrate the facility without triggering alarms. Might being the operative word, Maggie said dryly. There's something else, Jimmy said, his expression becoming even more grave. According to my father's notes, the research program has been building toward a specific goal. They've been developing a chemical agent that can be deployed through water supplies, agricultural systems, or atmospheric dispersal to modify the genetic structure of entire populations. Eleanor confirmed his assessment. A weaponized version of the enhancement compounds designed to be used on a massive scale. If they've succeeded in perfecting this agent, they could potentially alter the genetic makeup of millions of people without their knowledge or consent. The ultimate biological weapon, Maggie said quietly, not designed to kill but to control. Exactly. And according to the timeline in Stefan's documents, they were planning to begin operational deployment sometime in the mid-2020s. The implications were staggering. If the Millbrook research program had succeeded in developing large-scale genetic modification capabilities, they possessed the power to reshape human civilization itself. In the wrong hands, such technology could be used to create a genetically stratified society where enhanced elites ruled over unmodified masses. When do you want to attempt the infiltration? Tomorrow night, Hal said. We've been monitoring their activity patterns, and Friday nights typically have minimal security presence in the underground complex. Most of the research staff operates on a Monday through Thursday schedule with only essential monitoring systems active over the weekend. What about Chad and his friends? They'll be at the regional football playoffs in Indianapolis, Eleanor said. The entire town will be focused on the game, which should provide additional cover for your operation. Maggie studied the facility maps and security assessments, her tactical training automatically identifying potential infiltration routes and escape plans. The mission was dangerous, but it was feasible if executed with proper planning and discipline. I'll need communications equipment that can't be detected by their security systems. Jimmy smiled grimly. My father was paranoid about electronic surveillance. He developed several communication devices that operate on frequencies the government wasn't monitoring in the 1980s. I've updated them with modern components, but they should still be invisible to conventional detection systems. And if something goes wrong, we'll be monitoring from multiple locations, Hal assured Hiromo. If you don't report in according to the predetermined schedule, we'll assume you've been compromised and activate our emergency protocols, which are simultaneous release of all the evidence we've gathered to every major news organization, congressional representative, and law enforcement agency in the country. Eleanor said firmly, if they silence you, they won't be able to silence the truth. As the meeting broke up and the conspirators prepared to leave through separate exits, Maggie felt the familiar pre-mission tension settling over her like a familiar coat. She had undertaken dangerous operations before, but never one where the stakes were so high and the enemies so well entrenched. But she was a Marine, and Marines didn't abandon their missions because the odds were against them. Tomorrow night, she would descend into the underground darkness beneath Millbrook and confront secrets that had been hidden for nearly half a century. The question was whether she would emerge alive with the evidence needed to bring justice to the victims of America's most horrific domestic conspiracy. Friday night in Millbrook arrived with the kind of bone-deep cold that turned breath into clouds and made every step crunch on frozen ground. While the rest of the town was gathered around radios and televisions following the Millbrook Eagles playoff game in Indianapolis, Maggie O'Sullivan was preparing for the most dangerous mission of her military career. She had spent the day in careful preparation, studying the facility maps Jimmy Kowalski had provided and memorizing the security protocols Hal Stevenson had documented. The infiltration would require her to enter through a maintenance tunnel that connected the abandoned Texaco station to the main underground complex, navigate through sections of the facility without triggering detection systems, and gather photographic evidence of the research operations. If everything went according to plan, she would be inside the complex for no more than 2 hours. If something went wrong, she might never come out at all. The equipment Eleanor Hartwell had assembled was a mixture of medical instruments and military hardware digital cameras capable of operating in low-light conditions, sample containers for biological specimens, detection devices for chemical agents, and communication gear that would allow her to maintain contact with her support team. Most importantly, she carried a miniaturized recording device that would document everything she encountered in the underground complex. If she didn't survive the mission, at least her evidence might. At 11:30 p.m., Maggie approached the abandoned Texaco station through the same cornfield route she had used for surveillance for noon. The building appeared completely dark, just another piece of rural decay in a landscape full of economic failures. But her thermal imaging equipment revealed the heat signatures of active machinery beneath the ground, confirmation that the underground facility was operating even when the surface appeared abandoned. The maintenance tunnel entrance Jimmy had identified was located behind the station, concealed beneath what appeared to be a rusted metal grate that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. But when Maggie examined it closely, she found that the grate was actually a sophisticated concealment device that could be opened with the proper access codes. The codes themselves had been another gift from Stefan Kowalski's paranoid preparation. The Polish scientist had documented every security system he encountered, including the maintenance protocols that would allow emergency access to the underground complex. His son had updated the information based on decades of careful observation, providing Maggie with entry credentials that should bypass the automated security systems. The tunnel itself was a masterpiece of covert engineering, a concrete line passage that extended deep underground while maintaining perfect environmental controls. As Maggie descended through the access shaft, she could feel the temperature and humidity stabilizing at levels designed to protect sensitive equipment and biological materials. The first section of the facility she encountered was clearly dedicated to storage and logistics. Rows of metal shelving contained supplies that ranged from standard laboratory equipment to specialized containers bearing biohazard symbols and classification markings. The sheer volume of materials suggested an operation far larger than anything she had imagined, based on the surface evidence. But it was the personnel records she found in the administrative section that provided the first shocking revelation about the scope of the conspiracy. The files contained detailed dossiers on hundreds of individuals who had been subjected to various forms of experimentation over the past 40 years. Veterans, civilians, even children who had been selected for genetic modification programs based on criteria that included genetic compatibility, social isolation, and family history. What made the records even more disturbing was the discovery that many of the test subjects were still alive, still being monitored, still undergoing treatments that they believed were routine medical care. The program hadn't ended with the official closure of the research facilities in the 1980s. It had simply become more sophisticated, more subtle, and more extensive. Maggie photographed dozens of files documenting the names, treatment protocols, and current status of victims who had no idea they were part of an ongoing human experimentation program. The evidence was overwhelming, but she knew she needed more than administrative records to convince skeptical authorities. The biological research section provided that additional evidence in ways that exceeded her worst fears. The laboratories she discovered in the deeper sections of the complex were equipped with technology that seemed decades ahead of anything she had seen in military research facilities. Genetic sequencing equipment, cellular modification chambers, and biological synthesis systems that could apparently manufacture custom organisms designed for specific purposes. But the most horrifying discovery was the breeding program. In a section of the facility that required additional security clearances to access, Maggie found evidence of systematic genetic manipulation of human reproductive cells. The program appeared to be designed to create enhanced bloodlines that would possess specific physical and mental characteristics while appearing completely normal to casual observation. The documentation showed that dozens of families in Millbrook had been participating in this program for multiple generations, producing children who were the products of careful genetic engineering rather than natural reproduction. The Brennan family was just one of several bloodlines that had been enhanced through decades of covert manipulation. Chad Brennan wasn't just a spoiled teenager with influential parents. He was a genetically modified human being, designed from conception to possess enhanced physical capabilities, increased intelligence and psychological characteristics that made him ideal for maintaining control over the local population. As Maggie photographed the breeding records and genetic modification protocols, she began to understand the true scope of what had been happening in Millbrook. This wasn't just human experimentation. It was the systematic creation of a genetically enhanced ruling class that would possess capabilities far beyond those of unmodified humans. But her most shocking discovery was yet to come. In the deepest section of the underground complex behind security doors that required biometric identification to open, Maggie found the current research program that represented the culmination of 40 years of illegal experimentation. The weaponization laboratory contained equipment for mass production of genetic modification agents that could be deployed through water supplies, agricultural systems, or atmospheric dispersal. The scale of the operation suggested that they were preparing to modify the genetic structure of entire populations without their knowledge or consent. The target populations, according to the planning documents she photographed, included major metropolitan areas throughout the Midwest, cities with millions of residents who would be exposed to genetic modification agents disguised as routine public health measures or environmental protection programs. The timeline for deployment showed that operational testing had already begun in several smaller communities, with full-scale implementation planned for the following year. If the program proceeded as planned, millions of Americans would be subjected to genetic modification without their knowledge, creating a two-tier society of enhanced and unmodified humans. But the most disturbing element of the weaponization program was its ultimate purpose. The genetic modifications weren't designed to enhance human capabilities across the board. They were designed to create specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who possessed the countermeasures. The enhanced bloodlines like the Brennan family would be immune to the genetic modifications, while the general population would become increasingly dependent on treatments and therapies that only the conspirators could provide. It was a plan for absolute biological control of human civilization, hidden behind the mask of medical progress and public health. As Maggie documented the weaponization protocols and production schedules, she heard the sound that every infiltrator dreads: footsteps in the corridor outside the laboratory where she was working. The security patrol she had been told to expect wasn't supposed to arrive for another hour, but something had apparently triggered an early inspection. She had perhaps 30 seconds to conceal her presence before the patrol entered the section where she was gathering evidence. The laboratory offered limited concealment options, but her military training had taught her to make the most of any available cover. She positioned herself behind a bank of equipment that would hide her from casual observation while still allowing her to monitor the patrol's activities. 3 figures entered the laboratory, but they weren't the routine security guards she had expected. One was clearly a scientist or technician, checking readouts on the genetic modification equipment. The other 2 were dressed in military-style clothing and carried themselves with the alertness of combat veterans. What alarmed Maggie most was the casual efficiency with which they conducted their inspection. This wasn't a routine security check. They were looking for signs of intrusion, examining the equipment and documentation areas where an infiltrator might have operated. Someone had detected her presence in the facility. The technical specialist was examining the very files she had been photographing, checking to see if anything had been disturbed or copied. The military personnel were conducting a systematic search of the laboratory, looking for evidence that an unauthorized person had accessed the restricted areas. Maggie realized that her mission had been compromised, but she couldn't determine whether the security response was the result of detection systems she hadn't anticipated or intelligence from an informant who had knowledge of her infiltration plan. Either way, her extraction window was rapidly closing. She needed to reach the maintenance tunnel and escape the facility before the security team expanded their search to the route she had used to enter the complex. But as she prepared to move from her concealment, she heard a conversation between the security personnel that changed everything she thought she understood about the situation in Millbrook. "The senator wants confirmation that the test deployment is proceeding on schedule," one of the military figures was saying. "The oversight committee is getting nervous about maintaining secrecy much longer. Tell the senator that we'll be ready for full implementation by spring." the technician replied. The genetic modification agents have tested successfully in all the pilot communities. We can begin metropolitan deployment as soon as we receive authorization. What about the local security situation? There have been reports of someone asking questions about historical research programs. The sheriff is handling it. If the problem can't be resolved through normal channels, we have authorization to use more direct methods. The conversation continued for several more minutes, revealing details about political oversight of the program that extended to the highest levels of government. Senators, congressional committee chairs, and federal agency directors were all aware of the genetic modification program and actively supporting its implementation. When the security team finally left the laboratory, Maggie remained hidden for another 10 minutes to ensure they had moved to a different section of the facility. But the intelligence she had gathered during their conversation was almost as valuable as the documentary evidence she had been collecting. The Millbrook conspiracy wasn't just a rogue operation that had been hidden from federal oversight. It was an officially sanctioned program that involved elements of the legislative and executive branches of government. Exposing the local participants would only reveal the tip of an iceberg that extended throughout the highest levels of American political power. As she made her way back through the underground complex toward the maintenance tunnel, Maggie felt the weight of what she had discovered. She possessed evidence of crimes against humanity that had been committed with the knowledge and approval of people who had sworn oaths to protect the Constitution and defend the American people. But she also knew that the very scope of the conspiracy would make it almost impossible to achieve justice through normal legal channels. Too many powerful people had too much to lose if the truth about genetic modification programs became public knowledge. The extraction through the maintenance tunnel proceeded without incident, but as Maggie emerged from the underground complex into the frozen December night, she realized that her mission had been only partially successful. She had gathered overwhelming evidence of ongoing crimes, but she had also discovered that the enemy she was fighting had resources and political protection that extended far beyond Millbrook. The war for the truth was about to become much more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. As she made her way back through the cornfields toward her extraction point, Maggie heard the distant sound of sirens echoing across the landscape. Either the security team had discovered evidence of her infiltration or some other crisis was developing in Millbrook that would complicate her efforts to expose the conspiracy. But whatever challenges lay ahead, she now possessed the evidence needed to reveal one of the most horrific domestic conspiracies in American history. The question was whether she would live long enough to ensure that evidence reached the people who could act on it. The real battle for Millbrook was about to begin. Saturday morning dawned gray and bitter across Millbrook, with a wind that cut through the bare trees like a knife and rattled the windows of houses, where families were waking up to what they believed was just another peaceful weekend in small-town America. But in her apartment above Kowalski's hardware store, Maggie O'Sullivan was processing evidence that revealed the peaceful facade to be the most elaborate lie ever perpetrated on the American people. The photographic and documentary evidence from her infiltration of the underground facility filled 3 encrypted hard drives that she had distributed to different secure locations around town. But even more valuable was the intelligence she had gathered about the political network that protected and funded the genetic modification program. The conversation she had overheard between the security personnel provided names, organizational structures, and operational timelines that transformed her understanding of what she was fighting. This wasn't just a local conspiracy that had grown out of control. It was a systematic program of human experimentation that had been authorized at the highest levels of government and implemented across multiple states over several decades. But her moment of revelation was interrupted by an urgent communication from Harold Stevenson. The encrypted radio Jimmy Kowalski had provided crackled to life at 0800 hours with a message that sent ice through her veins. "Maggie, you need to get out of town immediately. Tom Brennan has issued an all-points bulletin claiming you're wanted for questioning in connection with terrorist activities. State police are setting up roadblocks on all the major routes out of Millbrook." The response was faster and more aggressive than she had anticipated. Either the security team had found evidence of her infiltration sooner than expected, or someone with access to her mission planning had warned the conspirators that she was gathering evidence against them. "What's the official story?" she asked. "They're claiming you're a disgruntled veteran who has been gathering information about government facilities for the purpose of planning terrorist attacks. Sheriff Brennan told the state police that you've been conducting surveillance of critical infrastructure and making threats against local officials. It was a cleverly constructed frame that would be difficult to refute without revealing the true nature of her investigation. Any evidence she presented about illegal human experimentation would be dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of a mentally unstable veteran who was seeking revenge against the government. How much time do I have? Maybe an hour before they complete the perimeter around town. But Maggie, there's something else. Eleanor Hartwell didn't come home last night. Her neighbors saw unmarked vehicles at her house around midnight, and she hasn't been seen since. The news hit Maggie like a physical blow. Eleanor had been one of the bravest people she had ever met, a woman who had spent decades documenting crimes against her community, despite constant threats and intimidation. If the conspirators had escalated to kidnapping or murder, it meant they were abandoning any pretense of legal cover for their actions. What about Jimmy? Still safe as far as I know, but he's gone underground. We have to assume that anyone associated with our investigation is now a target. Maggie considered her options, none of which offered much hope for a successful escape. The state police roadblocks would be equipped with technology that could identify her vehicle, and any attempt to flee on foot across the frozen countryside would be suicidal in December weather. But surrender wasn't an option either. If she was taken into custody by law enforcement officials who were either corrupted or deceived by the Brennan family, she would disappear just as completely as Eleanor Hartwell had. The evidence she had gathered would be confiscated and destroyed, and the genetic modification program would continue without interference. Her only chance was to find a way to transmit the evidence to reliable parties before she was captured. But that required secure communications equipment and contacts who couldn't be compromised by the conspiracy's political network. The solution came from an unexpected source. At 0830 hours, she received a communication on a frequency that wasn't part of the equipment Jimmy Kowalski had provided. The voice was unfamiliar, but the security protocols were military standard and properly authenticated. Mrs. O'Sullivan, this is Colonel Marcus Torres, Defense Intelligence Agency. I'm calling to inform you that federal authorities are aware of your situation and are prepared to provide assistance. How did you get this frequency? We've been monitoring communications in the Millbrook area as part of a broader investigation into unauthorized human experimentation programs. Your activities last night triggered alerts in several federal databases that brought your situation to our attention. The news that federal agencies were already investigating the Millbrook conspiracy was encouraging, but Maggie's intelligence training had taught her to be suspicious of unexpected assistance. What kind of assistance? Immediate extraction from your current location and transportation to a secure federal facility where you can provide testimony about what you've discovered. We're also prepared to offer protective custody for any allies you've been working with. What about the evidence I've gathered? That evidence will be crucial to our investigation. We're particularly interested in any documentation you may have obtained about the scope and political oversight of the genetic modification program. The conversation was proceeding exactly as Maggie would have hoped, but something about the timing and the colonel's knowledge of her activities was troubling. Federal investigations typically took months or years to develop, but Torres was talking as if he had been tracking her mission in real time. Colonel, I need independent verification of your identity before I can proceed. Of course. Contact DIA headquarters in Washington and ask for verification of Colonel Marcus Torres attached to the Counter Proliferation Analysis Unit. My security clearance number is Delta 7 Alpha 419. Maggie used a different communication device to place the verification call, routing it through multiple encrypted relays to avoid detection by local monitoring systems. The response from DIA headquarters confirmed that Colonel Torres was a legitimate intelligence officer assigned to investigate weapons proliferation and unauthorized research programs. But the verification also revealed something that made her decision more complicated. Mrs. O'Sullivan, the DIA duty officer, explained, Colonel Torres has been investigating reports of illegal biological research in the Midwest for the past 3 years. However, his investigation has been repeatedly obstructed by classification restrictions and jurisdictional disputes with other agencies. What kind of restrictions? The programs he's investigating appear to have congressional oversight and intelligence community authorization that places them beyond the scope of normal law enforcement. His unit has been limited to gathering intelligence rather than conducting active investigations. The implication was clear. Even if Colonel Torres was legitimate and well-intentioned, his ability to take action against the Millbrook conspiracy might be severely limited by the same political protection that had allowed the program to operate for decades. Maggie had to make a decision, trust the federal authorities who might be constrained by bureaucratic limitations, or continue operating independently with the hope of finding a way to expose the conspiracy through other channels. Her decision was made for her when she heard the sound of vehicles approaching her building. Through her window, she could see 3 police cars converging on Kowalski's hardware store, along with what appeared to be federal agents in unmarked sedans. Either Colonel Torres had arranged for her protection as promised, or the net was closing around her faster than anyone had anticipated. She grabbed the encrypted hard drives containing her evidence and activated the emergency communication protocol Jimmy Kowalski had established. If she was captured or killed, the evidence would be automatically transmitted to a network of contacts who had committed to exposing the truth regardless of personal consequences. The knock on her door was firm and professional, the kind of approach used by law enforcement officers who expected cooperation rather than resistance. Mrs. O'Sullivan, this is Agent Jennifer Martinez, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We're here to provide protective custody in connection with your investigation of illegal research activities in Millbrook. The voice was professional and authoritative, but Maggie's combat experience had taught her not to trust voices from the other side of locked doors. She needed visual confirmation of identity and independent verification of the federal response. Agent Martinez, I need to see identification and receive confirmation from Colonel Torres before I can comply. Colonel Torres is downstairs with our tactical team. He asked me to inform you that time is critical. Local law enforcement is en route to this location with arrest warrants that would compromise your safety and the security of your evidence. The pressure to make an immediate decision was exactly what Maggie would have expected from either legitimate federal agents operating under time constraints or hostile forces attempting to force her into a vulnerable position. She decided to test their intentions. Agent Martinez, I'm prepared to cooperate, but I need to secure additional evidence that's located elsewhere in town. Can your team provide security for a brief recovery operation? There was a pause before the response came long enough to suggest consultation with supervisors or mission planners. Mrs. O'Sullivan, our priority is your immediate safety. Evidence recovery can be arranged after you're in federal protective custody. It was the wrong answer. If the federal agents were legitimate, they would have been primarily interested in securing the evidence rather than extracting her from the area. The fact that they were prioritizing her removal over evidence preservation suggested that their real purpose was to silence her rather than support her investigation. Maggie activated the final element of her emergency protocol, a dead man's switch that would trigger immediate transmission of her evidence to multiple news organizations, congressional offices, and federal agencies if she failed to deactivate it within specified time intervals. Then she prepared for what would likely be the final battle of her military career. The building's layout offered several tactical advantages that civilian law enforcement wouldn't anticipate. As the proprietor of a hardware store, Jimmy Kowalski had installed security measures that included reinforced doors, bulletproof windows, and emergency exits that connected to the building's basement and the underground tunnel system that honeycombed central Millbrook. If she could reach the tunnel system, she might be able to evade capture long enough for the evidence transmission protocol to complete its distribution cycle. Even if she didn't survive, the truth about the genetic modification program would be revealed to parties who couldn't be silenced or intimidated. The sound of breaking glass from the store below indicated that the tactical team was beginning their assault. Maggie had perhaps 3 minutes to implement her escape plan before they reached her apartment and overwhelmed her defensive position. She gathered the essential elements of her evidence package and moved toward the emergency exit Jimmy had shown her during his security briefing. But as she opened the concealed door that led to the escape route, she found herself facing a figure she hadn't expected to encounter. Chad Brennan stood in the narrow stairway that led to the basement, but he wasn't the arrogant teenager she remembered from her chemistry class. He was dressed in military-style gear and carried himself with the disciplined alertness of a trained operative. His cold blue eyes held the kind of focused intensity that she had seen in special operations personnel who were prepared to use lethal force. "Hello, Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said quietly. "I think it's time we had that conversation I've been promising you." For the first time since her infiltration mission had begun, Maggie realized that she had seriously underestimated the sophistication of the forces she was fighting. Chad Brennan wasn't just a genetically enhanced teenager who was being groomed for future leadership. He was an active participant in the conspiracy, someone who had been trained to handle exactly the kind of threat she represented. The war for Millbrook was about to become much more personal and immediate than she had ever imagined. The narrow stairway that connected Jimmy Kowalski's hardware store to the underground tunnel system had become a battlefield where two generations of American warriors faced each other across an ideological divide that could not be bridged through negotiation or compromise. Maggie O'Sullivan, representing 22 years of honorable military service and an unshakable commitment to protecting the innocent, stood at the top of the stairs with her hand resting on the emergency transmission device that could expose decades of government crimes. Chad Brennan, the product of genetic enhancement and a lifetime of indoctrination into a conspiracy that viewed ordinary Americans as experimental subjects, blocked her escape route with the calm confidence of someone who had been trained for this moment since childhood. "You've been very impressive, Mrs. O'Sullivan," Chad said, his voice carrying none of the teenage arrogance she remembered from the classroom. "My father and grandfather always said that Marines were the most dangerous opponents because they never knew when to quit. They were right." "Let me pass, Chad. You don't want to be part of this." "But I am part of this," he replied. "I've been part of this since before I was born. My entire genetic structure was designed to prepare me for moments like this, when the security of the program would depend on my ability to neutralize threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't handle." The tactical team was moving through the hardware store above them, their heavy footsteps and radio communications indicating a systematic search that would reach the basement level within minutes. Maggie needed to resolve this confrontation quickly if she was going to have any chance of escaping through the tunnel system. "Chad, do you understand what your family has been doing? Do you know about the people who have been killed to protect these secrets? I know that my grandfather served his country by participating in research that enhanced America's biological defense capabilities. I know that my father has continued that service by maintaining the security necessary for ongoing operations. And I know that people like you who don't understand the bigger picture have always been willing to sacrifice national security for the sake of individual comfort." It was the voice of someone who had been completely indoctrinated into a worldview that justified any atrocity in the name of national security. But Maggie could also hear something else in Chad's tone, a trace of uncertainty that suggested his conditioning might not be as complete as his handlers believed. "Chad, I've been inside the underground facility. I've seen the records of what was done to American citizens." "Children, Chad. They experimented on children." For just a moment, something flickered in the young man's eyes, a trace of doubt, perhaps even horror, that suggested the human being beneath the genetic modifications was still capable of moral recognition. "Those experiments saved lives," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. "The enhancements we developed have made America stronger, more capable of defending itself against biological threats from hostile nations." "What about the weaponization program? The plan to modify the genetic structure of entire cities without their knowledge or consent?" Chad's expression hardened again, but Maggie could see that her words were having an impact. Despite his training and conditioning, he was beginning to confront contradictions between his family's propaganda and the evidence of their actual activities. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made by people who understand the full scope of the threats we face. The general population doesn't have access to classified intelligence about biological warfare programs in China, Russia, and North Korea. If they understood the real dangers, they would beg us to take whatever measures are necessary to protect them. By turning them into experimental subjects without their consent, by giving them enhanced capabilities that will allow them to survive threats they can't even imagine. The sound of the tactical team reaching the main floor of the hardware store indicated that their conversation was running out of time. But Maggie could see that Chad was genuinely struggling with the moral implications of what she had revealed. "Chad, what if you're wrong? What if the program isn't about protection, but about control? What if your family has been using national security as an excuse to build their own personal empire?" "That's impossible. My grandfather was a patriot who served his country for 40 years. My father has dedicated his life to continuing that service." Your grandfather murdered American veterans who tried to expose illegal human experimentation. Your father is planning to deploy the genetic modification agents on millions of innocent people. Does that sound like patriotic service to you? The tactical team had reached the basement level and was beginning to search the storage areas that connected to the tunnel system. Maggie had perhaps 60 seconds before they discovered the concealed entrance where she and Chad were having their confrontation. But Chad's response surprised her. If what you're saying is true, he said slowly, if the program has gone beyond legitimate defense research into something that's actually harming innocent people, then it needs to be stopped. Chad, I have evidence that can expose the entire conspiracy, but only if I can get it to people who aren't part of the cover-up. Help me reach the tunnel system, and I can make sure the truth gets out. The young man studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing everything he had been taught against the evidence she had presented. It was the internal battle between indoctrination and conscience that had played out in the minds of soldiers throughout history when they were forced to confront the moral implications of their orders. If I help you, he said finally, I'll be betraying everything my family has worked for. Everyone I care about will see me as a traitor. Chad, if you don't help me, you'll be betraying everyone who believes in the Constitution and the principles this country was founded on. Sometimes being a real patriot means standing up to the people who claim they're protecting you. The sound of approaching footsteps in the basement indicated that the tactical team was closing in on their position. Chad looked toward the main stairway, then back at Maggie, his expression showing the internal struggle between loyalty and conscience. Then he made his decision. The tunnel system connects to several buildings in downtown Millbrook, he said quickly. But most of the exits are monitored by security systems that will detect your movement. There's one route that my grandfather built as an emergency escape path that bypasses all the electronic surveillance. He pulled out a hand-drawn map that showed a complex route through underground passages that had been excavated during the original construction of the research facility. This path leads to the old Millbrook Bank building, which has been abandoned for 15 years. From there, you can reach the surface through a concealed exit in the alley behind Main Street. What about you? I'm going to stay here and convince the tactical team that you escaped through a different route. That should give you enough time to reach the bank building and transmit your evidence before they can track you down. It was a plan that would almost certainly result in Chad facing severe consequences when his deception was discovered. But the fact that he was willing to sacrifice his own safety to help expose the conspiracy suggested that his conditioning hadn't completely destroyed his capacity for moral reasoning. Chad, when this is over, when the truth comes out, you're going to need protection from the people who will see you as a traitor to their cause. I can arrange for you to enter federal witness protection to start a new life away from all this. Maybe, he said, but first we need to make sure the truth actually gets out. The tactical team was now searching the areas immediately adjacent to their concealed position. Chad gestured for Maggie to move quickly through the tunnel entrance while he prepared to misdirect the search operation. As she disappeared into the underground passage that would take her to the abandoned bank building, Maggie heard Chad calling out to the tactical team with perfectly executed deception about her escape route. His performance was so convincing that even she might have believed he was genuinely trying to help capture her. The tunnel system was more extensive than she had realized, with passages that connected not just the major buildings in downtown Millbrook, but also to natural cave systems that extended for miles in all directions. If necessary, she could use these underground routes to reach locations far outside the perimeter that law enforcement had established around the town. But her primary objective was to reach a secure transmission point where she could upload the evidence to news organizations and federal agencies that couldn't be compromised by the conspiracy's political protection. The abandoned bank building would provide the isolation and technical infrastructure she needed to complete the evidence distribution protocol. As she made her way through the underground passages, Maggie reflected on the extraordinary courage Chad Brennan had shown in deciding to help her expose the crimes his family had committed. Despite his genetic enhancements and his lifetime of conditioning, he had ultimately chosen to follow his conscience rather than his programming. It was a reminder that no matter how sophisticated the methods of control and indoctrination became, human beings retained the fundamental capacity to choose between right and wrong. The genetic modification program might be able to enhance physical and mental capabilities, but it couldn't completely erase the moral instincts that defined human nature. The abandoned bank building, when she reached it, was a monument to economic decline and political corruption. Built in 1923 during Millbrook's agricultural prosperity, it had served the community for 70 years before being closed during the banking consolidations of the 1990s. But as Maggie explored the building's basement, she discovered that it had been equipped with communication systems that were far more sophisticated than anything a small-town bank would have needed. The equipment was military-grade, designed for secure transmission of classified information over long distances. The discovery suggested that the bank building had served as a communication hub for the underground research facility, a place where information could be transmitted to and from the various agencies that were involved in overseeing the genetic modification program. But the same equipment that had been used to coordinate illegal human experimentation could now be used to expose those crimes to the world. Maggie activated the transmission protocol that would distribute her evidence to more than 50 different recipients, including major news organizations, congressional investigators, and federal agencies that weren't compromised by the conspiracy. The process would take approximately 30 minutes to complete, during which she would need to maintain security around the transmission site. As the upload process began, she heard the sound of vehicles approaching the bank building. The tactical team had either discovered Chad's deception more quickly than expected, or they had identified the bank building through other intelligence sources. Either way, she now faced the prospect of defending her position for 30 minutes against opponents who possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers, equipment, and local knowledge. But Margaret O'Sullivan was a Marine trained to hold defensive positions against superior enemy forces. If this was going to be her final battle, she would ensure that it was worthy of the uniform she had worn with honor for 22 years. The war for the truth about Millbrook was entering its final phase, and the outcome would determine whether the American people learned about one of the most horrific domestic conspiracies in their nation's history. As she prepared her defensive positions and monitored the progress of the evidence transmission, Maggie allowed herself to hope that her mission would succeed, that the truth would be revealed, and that justice would finally come to the victims of decades of illegal human experimentation. The sounds of the tactical team positioning themselves around the bank building indicated that the final confrontation was about to begin. But whatever happened in the next 30 minutes, Maggie knew that she had fulfilled her duty as a Marine and as an American citizen. The rest was up to the American people and their elected representatives to decide what to do with the truth she had risked everything to reveal. The abandoned Millbrook Bank stood like a fortress of forgotten dreams on Main Street, its limestone facade bearing the carved inscription, "Founded on trust, built on honor," words that had become a bitter irony in a town where trust had been betrayed and honor sacrificed for the sake of unspeakable secrets. Inside the building's basement, surrounded by communication equipment that had once coordinated decades of illegal human experimentation, Margaret O'Sullivan prepared for what would likely be the final battle of her life. The evidence transmission protocol showed 18 minutes remaining until completion, 18 minutes during which she would need to hold off a tactical team equipped with military-grade weapons and trained in urban assault operations. The first probe came at 0147 hours, when two members of the tactical team attempted to breach the building through the main entrance. Maggie had anticipated this approach and positioned herself to observe their entry without being detected. The men were clearly professionals, moving with the coordinated precision of special operations personnel, but they were operating in an environment they didn't fully understand, relying on floor plans rather than personal familiarity with the building's layout. At 0152 hours, the tactical team attempted to infiltrate through the underground tunnel system. Maggie had anticipated this as well, using her knowledge of the tunnel layout to establish an ambush position. The engagement was brief but decisive. Two tactical operatives entered the tunnel system, but her superior knowledge of the terrain provided a critical advantage. The transmission protocol showed 11 minutes remaining when she heard helicopter rotors approaching from multiple directions. The assault team was being reinforced by air mobile units that would completely surround the building and eliminate any possibility of escape. "Control, this is Team Alpha. Target building appears secure, but we're detecting active transmission equipment in the basement level. Recommend immediate jamming of all communication frequencies." Negative, Team Alpha. Electronic warfare specialists report that interrupting the transmission could trigger automated distribution protocols. Maintain surveillance and prepare for direct action if the upload cannot be stopped through other means. The conversation confirmed what Maggie had suspected, The conspirators were more afraid of her evidence reaching the public than they were of the tactical situation she presented. They understood that once the documentation became public knowledge, no amount of political protection would prevent congressional investigations and criminal prosecutions. The transmission protocol showed 7 minutes remaining when the assault team began their final approach to the basement level. Multiple entry points were being breached simultaneously with coordinated teams moving through the main building tunnel system and ventilation shafts. Maggie positioned herself in the vault area where the transmission equipment was located using the reinforced construction to create a defensive position that would force the assault teams to approach through carefully prepared killing fields. The final assault began at 01:59 hours with a coordinated breach of all entry points. Flashbang grenades and smoke canisters filled the interior spaces with chaos and confusion, while multiple teams advanced toward the basement level. The transmission protocol showed 3 minutes remaining when Colonel Hayes himself entered the vault area under a flag of truce. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he called out. "I'm Colonel Marcus Hayes, United States Army Special Operations Command. I'm authorized to offer you full immunity from prosecution and protection under the Federal Witness Security Program in exchange for aborting the transmission and cooperating with a classified investigation." "Colonel, how do I know you're not part of the cover-up?" "Because I've spent the last 6 months investigating reports of unauthorized human experimentation in the Midwest, and everything you've discovered confirms intelligence we've been gathering through other sources. But if this information becomes public through unofficial channels, it will compromise ongoing investigations and allow the responsible parties to destroy evidence and escape prosecution." The transmission protocol showed 90 seconds remaining. Maggie had to make a decision that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone who had been victimized by the genetic modification program. She chose to trust her instincts as a Marine rather than the promises of officials who might be well-intentioned, but powerless to deliver on their commitments. "Colonel, if your investigation is legitimate, then you'll have no problem incorporating the evidence I'm transmitting into your official proceedings. But I'm not going to abort the transmission based on promises from people I don't know and can't verify." The transmission completed at 02:02 hours with confirmation signals indicating that the evidence had been successfully delivered to more than 50 recipients across multiple jurisdictions and organizations. Whatever happened next, the truth about Millbrook's genetic modification program was now in the hands of people who couldn't be silenced or intimidated. Dawn came to Millbrook like a revelation, painting the frozen landscape in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to herald the end of an era built on darkness and deception. By 600 hours, every major news organization in the country was broadcasting preliminary reports about the evidence that had been transmitted from the abandoned bank building. Margaret O'Sullivan sat in a federal holding facility in Indianapolis, watching the news coverage on a television provided by agents who seemed as shocked by the revelations as the general public. Colonel Hayes had been true to his word about treating her as a cooperating witness rather than a criminal suspect. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. 40 years of illegal human experimentation conducted with the knowledge and approval of officials at the highest levels of government. Systematic genetic modification of American citizens without their knowledge or consent. Murder and intimidation used to silence anyone who tried to expose the crimes. The political response was swift and devastating. Within hours of the initial reports, congressional leaders from both parties were demanding immediate investigations and criminal prosecutions. The president, facing the biggest crisis of his administration, ordered the formation of a special prosecutor's office with unlimited authority to investigate all aspects of the genetic modification program. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, held an emergency press conference announcing that her committee had been secretly investigating reports of unauthorized human experimentation for the past year. "The evidence provided by Mrs. O'Sullivan confirms our worst fears about programs that have been operating without proper oversight or authorization," Senator Williams declared. "These activities represent not just violations of federal law, but crimes against humanity that demand the strongest possible response." Sheriff Tom Brennan was arrested at his home by federal agents charged with conspiracy murder and violations of civil rights under federal law. Chad Brennan, whose decision to help Maggie escape had been documented by surveillance equipment, was taken into federal protective custody as a cooperating witness. The most significant development was the discovery of Stefan Kowalski, the Polish scientist presumed dead for 35 years. Federal agents found the elderly scientist alive, but in poor health, held captive in a medical facility that officially served as a private nursing home, but actually detained people who possessed dangerous knowledge about the genetic modification program. At 97 years old, Stefan Kowalski was one of the last surviving witnesses to the origins of the illegal research programs. His testimony provided the historical context that transformed the Millbrook conspiracy from a local crime story into a comprehensive indictment of government corruption spanning multiple decades. They told me I was helping to protect America from biological weapons, Kowalski said in a recorded statement broadcast on national television. Instead, I was forced to develop weapons that would be used against the American people themselves. When I tried to stop the program, they destroyed my life and imprisoned me for 35 years to keep me silent. The public response was unlike anything in modern American history. Protests erupted in cities across the country, with millions of Americans demanding accountability for what Senator Williams called the greatest betrayal of public trust since the founding of the Republic. Eleanor Hartwell, rescued from a secret detention facility outside Millbrook, became the spokesperson for a class action lawsuit seeking justice for thousands of people who had been subjected to illegal medical experimentation. For 50 years, I documented the crimes being committed against my patients and my community, Dr. Hartwell said at a press conference. I was told repeatedly that my concerns were unfounded. Now we know that every suspicion I had was correct. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in their scope and complexity. A special grand jury was impaneled to investigate all aspects of the genetic modification program, with subpoena power extending to the highest levels of government and the intelligence community. The investigation revealed that the Millbrook conspiracy was just one element of a broader network of illegal research programs operating in communities across the Midwest for more than 4 decades. Millbrook had served as the central coordination hub for experiments that had affected hundreds of thousands of Americans. The most disturbing discovery was the extent to which the genetic modification program had influenced American politics and society. Enhanced individuals like Chad Brennan had been placed in positions of influence throughout government, business, and academia, creating a shadow network of genetically modified Americans loyal to the conspiracy rather than to the Constitution. The revelation that some of America's most prominent leaders might be products of illegal genetic enhancement triggered a constitutional crisis. How could elections be considered legitimate if some candidates possessed genetic advantages? How could laws be valid if written by legislators whose enhanced capabilities made them fundamentally different from the people they represented? These questions led to the passage of the Genetic Verification Amendment to the Constitution, requiring all candidates for federal office to undergo genetic testing to confirm they had not been subjected to illegal enhancement procedures. More than 50 members of Congress were found to have genetic markers indicating exposure to enhancement procedures. Dozens of federal judges, cabinet members, and senior intelligence officials showed similar evidence of genetic modification. The discovery that enhanced individuals had been systematically placed in positions of power confirmed the conspiracy's ultimate objectives. The political purge that followed was swift and comprehensive. Enhanced individuals were removed from positions of authority and subjected to criminal investigation. New elections were held in districts where representatives were found to be products of illegal genetic modification. Congress passed the Human Genetic Protection Act, establishing the most comprehensive restrictions on genetic research in the world. The legislation created criminal penalties for any unauthorized modification of human genetic material and established oversight mechanisms designed to prevent secret programs like those that had operated in Millbrook. The law also created the National Center for Genetic Justice, an independent agency responsible for investigating historical cases of illegal human experimentation and providing support for victims of genetic modification programs. Eleanor Hartwell was appointed as the center's first director, bringing 5 decades of experience documenting genetic crimes to the task of ensuring that such atrocities could never happen again. 1 year after the transmission that exposed the Millbrook conspiracy, Margaret O'Sullivan stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee in a hearing room packed with victims, journalists, and family members of those who had died to protect the secrets she had revealed. The past 12 months had been a whirlwind of investigations, trials, and reforms that had fundamentally transformed American society's understanding of government accountability and human rights. For Maggie, the most important moment had come 6 months earlier when she walked back into the classroom at Millbrook High School as the town's new superintendent of education. Senator Patricia Williams, who had led the congressional investigation from the beginning, opened the hearing with a statement that captured the magnitude of what had been revealed. The evidence gathered over the past year has confirmed that the genetic modification program exposed by Mrs. O'Sullivan was one of the most systematic violations of human rights in American history, Senator Williams declared. More than 200,000 American citizens were subjected to unauthorized medical experimentation over 4 decades, with at least 3,000 deaths directly attributable to the illegal research programs. The criminal prosecutions had resulted in convictions at every level of government and society. Sheriff Tom Brennan had been sentenced to life in prison without parole for his role in murdering witnesses and coordinating cover-up activities. More than 40 federal officials, including 3 former cabinet members and 12 members of Congress, had been convicted of conspiracy and civil rights violations. The most significant legal development had been the prosecution of Dr. Marcus Webb, the lead scientist who had disappeared in 1987 and was discovered living under an assumed identity in Switzerland. Webb's extradition and trial had provided the most comprehensive account of the scientific methods used in the genetic modification program. Chad Brennan's testimony provided the most compelling account of how the genetic modification program had shaped individual lives and family relationships. Now 18 years old and enrolled in college, under a new identity provided by the Federal Witness Protection Program, Chad had spent the past year undergoing medical treatment to reverse some of the genetic modifications performed on him during childhood. I was raised to believe that my family were patriots protecting America from terrible threats, Chad testified. I was taught that the genetic enhancements I received were gifts that would allow me to serve my country more effectively. It wasn't until Mrs. O'Sullivan showed me the evidence that I understood I was the product of criminal activity that had destroyed thousands of lives. Chad's transformation from a genetically enhanced enforcer of the conspiracy into a young man committed to exposing the truth had been one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire investigation. His cooperation with federal authorities had provided crucial evidence about the methods used to recruit and control enhanced individuals. Dr. Stefan Kowalski, at 98 years old, was one of the last surviving scientists forced to participate in the original research programs. Despite his advanced age and health problems caused by 35 years of imprisonment, Kowalski had become one of the most effective advocates for victims of genetic experimentation. I came to America as a refugee from Nazi Germany, believing that I would find a country where human dignity was respected, Kowalski testified. Instead, I was forced to participate in programs that violated every moral principle I had learned. Kowalski's testimony was particularly powerful because of his unique perspective on the historical context of the genetic modification program. As a scientist who had witnessed Nazi medical experimentation during World War II, he could provide expert analysis of the similarities between German research in the 1940s and the programs operating in America for 4 decades. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, whose documentation of medical anomalies in Millbrook had provided crucial evidence for the investigation, testified about ongoing efforts to identify and treat victims of genetic modification programs throughout the United States. The National Center for Genetic Justice has identified more than 50,000 individuals who show evidence of unauthorized genetic modification, Dr. Hartwell reported. Many had no idea they had been subjected to experimental procedures, and some are only now beginning to understand the health problems they have experienced throughout their lives. The comprehensive reform of oversight mechanisms for government research programs had been established through the Genetic Accountability Act, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. The legislation established independent monitoring systems for all federal research involving human subjects and created criminal penalties for officials who authorize unauthorized experimentation. The legislation also created the Office of Research Ethics, an independent agency with authority to investigate suspected violations of research protocols and to shut down programs that pose risks to human health or civil liberties. As Maggie concluded her testimony before the Senate committee, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a chemistry classroom in rural Indiana to the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. When I first encountered Chad Brennan in my chemistry class, I thought I was dealing with a simple case of teenage bullying, she said. I had no idea that I was about to uncover one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in American history. The lesson of Millbrook is that democracy requires constant vigilance from citizens who are willing to risk their personal safety to protect the rights and dignity of their fellow Americans. We cannot delegate that responsibility to our elected officials or government institutions. We must accept it as the price of freedom. 2 years had passed since the last of the criminal trials had concluded, and Millbrook, Indiana had become something unprecedented in American history, a town reborn from the ashes of its own dark secrets into a beacon of transparency, accountability, and civic engagement. Margaret O'Sullivan stood at the window of her office in the newly constructed Millbrook Educational Complex, watching students from across the country arrive for the summer session of the National Institute for Democratic Leadership. The program, established with funds from the Class Action Settlement, brought together high school students from all 50 states to study constitutional government and individual responsibilities of citizenship in a democratic society. The institute was housed in a building constructed on the site of the old underground research facility, which had been completely excavated and filled with concrete after federal investigators completed their work. The symbolism was intentional. Where secrets had once been buried, knowledge would now be shared openly with the next generation of American leaders. The most remarkable transformation had occurred in the students who called Millbrook home. The revelation that many families had been victims of illegal genetic experimentation had created a generation of young people who understood viscerally the importance of questioning authority and protecting individual rights. Cao Yang, now a senior at Millbrook High School, had become one of the most articulate advocates for government accountability in the state. His testimony before the Indiana State Legislature about the need for enhanced oversight of government research programs had been instrumental in passing some of the strongest research ethics laws in the nation. Tyler Morrison, whose father Danny had been murdered for trying to expose the genetic modification program, had chosen to follow in his father's footsteps by pursuing a career in investigative journalism. At 18, he had already published articles in national magazines about government secrecy and the importance of whistleblower protection. Chad Brennan had returned to Millbrook after completing his rehabilitation and education under federal protection. Now 20 years old and enrolled in law school, Chad had become one of the most effective advocates for victims of genetic modification programs. His decision to return to the town where his family had committed such terrible crimes had been controversial, but Chad's commitment to making amends for his family's actions had won over even the most skeptical residents. I can't change what my family did, and I can't undo the genetic modifications that were performed on me, Chad had said at a town meeting where residents voted on whether to accept his return. But I can dedicate my life to making sure that the victims of these programs receive the justice and support they deserve. Chad's transformation from a genetically enhanced enforcer of the conspiracy into a young man committed to human rights and social justice had been one of the most closely studied aspects of the entire Millbrook case. The Millbrook Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a local body established to help the community process the trauma of discovering that their neighbors and leaders had been participants in a decades-long conspiracy, had provided a forum for victims to tell their stories, for perpetrators to acknowledge their crimes, and for the community to collectively confront the truth about its past. The hardest part wasn't learning that my family were criminals, Chad had testified before the commission. The hardest part was learning that I had been raised to be a criminal too, without even knowing it. But the commission has helped me understand that I can choose to be different, that I can use my life to repair some of the damage that was done. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, now 70 years old and serving as director of the National Center for Genetic Justice, had returned to Millbrook to deliver the keynote address at the Institute's second annual graduation ceremony. Millbrook has become proof that even the darkest secrets can be overcome through courage, truth, and community commitment. Dr. Hartwell told the assembled students and families, "The young people graduating from this program today will carry with them the knowledge that individual citizens have the power to hold their government accountable, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them." Harold Hal Stevenson, the Vietnam veteran whose documentation of suspicious deaths in Millbrook had provided crucial early evidence for the investigation, had become the unofficial historian of the Millbrook conspiracy. Now 80 years old and using a wheelchair due to health problems caused by his exposure to experimental chemicals, Hal had become a powerful voice for government accountability. I spent 50 years trying to get people to believe that something terrible was happening in our town, Hal said in his remarks to graduating students. I never imagined that it would take a Marine from outside our community to finally expose the truth. But I've learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who aren't even from the places they're trying to save. The Margaret O'Sullivan Scholarship had been established to bring outstanding students from across the country to study in Millbrook and learn about democratic resistance and government accountability. This year's recipients included the daughter of a whistleblower who had exposed Pentagon corruption, the son of an immigrant family who had fled political persecution, and a young woman whose grandfather had been a civil rights activist during the 1960s. Maria Santos, the investigative journalist who had helped expose the genetic modification program and now served on the Institute's board of directors, had won the Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the Millbrook conspiracy. The Millbrook Institute represents everything that is best about American democracy, Santos said to the graduating students. It shows that even the worst crimes against the American people can be transformed into opportunities for education and reform. The town government operated under the most transparent administrative procedures in the state, with all meetings open to the public and all documents available online unless specifically protected by federal law. The school district had implemented the most comprehensive civic education program in the country, with students required to study not just the Constitution and Bill of Rights, but also historical examples of government overreach and individual responsibilities of citizens in a democratic society. Most importantly, the community had developed a culture of questioning and accountability that made it almost impossible for secret programs to operate without detection. Citizens had been trained to recognize warning signs of government secrecy, and multiple overlapping oversight mechanisms ensured that any suspicious activities would be quickly investigated and exposed. For Margaret O'Sullivan, the most meaningful measure of Millbrook's transformation was the quality of questions asked by students in her classes in the program she supervised. The students who come through our programs don't just learn about government and constitutional principles. Maggie explained to a delegation of educators from Japan studying the Millbrook model. They learn to think critically about authority, to ask difficult questions about official explanations, and to recognize their personal responsibility to protect democratic institutions. Most importantly, they learn that individual courage can overcome institutional corruption, no matter how powerful or well-established that corruption might be. As the graduation ceremony concluded and families began to disperse back to their homes across the country, Maggie reflected on the journey that had brought Millbrook from the darkness of conspiracy to the light of transparency and accountability. The transformation had not been easy, and it was not yet complete. Some of the physical and psychological damage caused by the genetic modification program could never be fully repaired, and some of the trust broken by decades of deception would take generations to rebuild. But Millbrook had proved that even the most terrible secrets could be overcome, that even the most powerful conspiracies could be exposed, and that even the most damaged communities could heal and become stronger than they had been before. The town that had once been a symbol of government betrayal had become a symbol of democratic renewal, proof that the American experiment in self-government was strong enough to survive even its own worst failures. 5 years after the transmission that had changed American history, Margaret O'Sullivan, now bearing the silver stars of a Marine Corps general on her collar, stood at the podium of the United States Naval Academy, delivering the annual MacArthur Lecture on Leadership and Ethics to an audience of future military officers. The promotion to general had come as a result of a special act of Congress recognizing not just her military service, but her extraordinary contribution to exposing one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in American history. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, addressing the sea of young faces that represented the future of American military leadership. When I took my oath as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps 30 years ago, I thought I understood what it meant to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I learned in Millbrook, Indiana, that the most dangerous enemies of the Constitution are often those who claim to be protecting it. The genetic modification program that operated for 40 years in communities across America was justified by officials who said they were enhancing our national security. In reality, they were destroying the very freedoms that make America worth defending. The lecture hall was silent as Maggie described the investigation that had begun in a high school chemistry classroom and ended with the exposure of crimes against humanity committed by the United States government against its own citizens. The officers and officials who authorized these programs believed that their patriotic objectives justified any means. They convinced themselves that violating the rights of American citizens was acceptable if it served what they defined as the greater good. But the Constitution does not give us the authority to choose which rights to protect and which citizens to sacrifice. The Bill of Rights is not a menu from which we can select only the protections that are convenient for our operations. The audience of midshipmen listened with the intensity that military training instilled in young people, preparing to take oaths that would bind them for life to the defense of principles they were still learning to understand. The lesson of Millbrook is that following orders is not sufficient to fulfill your obligations as military officers. You have a higher duty to the Constitution that supersedes any orders you might receive from superiors who have forgotten their own oaths. Captain Chad Brennan, now 25 years old and serving as a Marine Corps intelligence officer, was one of the most vocal advocates for the military reforms that had followed the Millbrook revelations. His decision to join the military after completing law school had surprised many people who expected him to pursue a civilian career in human rights law. "I was genetically modified to serve a conspiracy that betrayed everything the uniform represents," Chad had said at his commissioning ceremony. "Now I want to serve the Constitution and the American people in the way my family should have served them from the beginning." Chad's presence in the military had been initially controversial, but his performance during training and his commitment to transparency and accountability had won over even the most skeptical colleagues. His unique background as both a victim and a product of the genetic modification program had made him an invaluable resource for counterintelligence operations. Chad Brennan represents the possibility of redemption even for those who were created to serve corrupt purposes, Maggie told the midshipman. His choice to use his abilities in service of the Constitution rather than in service of the conspiracy that created him proves that human conscience is more powerful than genetic programming. The ongoing medical monitoring of genetic modification victims had revealed that the effects of the experimental procedures were more complex and far-reaching than originally understood. Some victims had developed enhanced capabilities that provided advantages in certain types of work, while others had suffered from health problems that only became apparent years after their exposure. Barbara Eleanor Hartwell, now 75 years old and serving as senior advisor to the National Center for Genetic Justice, had become the leading expert on the medical and social implications of inherited genetic modifications. "We are essentially dealing with a new category of American citizen," Dr. Hartwell had testified before Congress. "These individuals are Americans with the same rights and responsibilities as any other citizens, but they may possess capabilities that are fundamentally different from those of unmodified humans." The concern about genetic discrimination had led to the passage of the Genetic Equality Act, which prohibited discrimination based on genetic modifications and established protections for both victims of genetic experimentation and their descendants. The 28th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified by 3/4 of the states in record time, required all candidates for federal office to disclose any genetic modifications they had received and to undergo independent medical evaluation to confirm the accuracy of their disclosures. The implementation of the amendment had been surprisingly smooth, with most enhanced individuals choosing to be open about their status, rather than risk the political and legal consequences of concealment. The transparency had led to a new era of political discourse that focused more on policy positions and character than on personal characteristics or background. The genetic modification program taught us that democracy can survive even the most sophisticated attempts to manipulate and control it, Maggie told the Naval Academy audience. But only if citizens remain vigilant and willing to challenge authority when it exceeds its legitimate bounds. The midshipmen who graduate from this academy will inherit a military that is stronger and more accountable because of the reforms that followed the Millbrook revelations. But they will also inherit the responsibility to ensure that such abuses never happen again. After the lecture, Maggie was approached by a group of first-year midshipmen who had questions about the practical application of the principles she had discussed. "General O'Sullivan," one of them asked, "how do we know when an order is illegal if our superiors tell us it's necessary for national security?" You start by understanding that the Constitution is the highest law of the land, superior to any order you might receive from any human authority. She replied, if an order requires you to violate the constitutional rights of American citizens, it is illegal, regardless of who gives it or what justification is offered. But more importantly, you develop the moral courage to ask difficult questions and to seek independent confirmation when something doesn't feel right. The genetic modification program succeeded for 40 years because too many good people chose not to ask questions that might have been uncomfortable for their superiors. As Maggie flew back to Indiana that evening, she reflected on the long journey that had brought her from a high school chemistry classroom to the podium of the Naval Academy. The investigation that had begun with a teenage bully's threats had ultimately transformed not just her own life, but the entire American understanding of government accountability and individual responsibility. The students she had taught at the Millbrook Institute were now adults working in government journalism education and law enforcement throughout the country. They carried with them the knowledge that even the most powerful conspiracies could be overcome by ordinary citizens who were willing to risk everything for the truth. The midshipmen she had just addressed would soon become military officers responsible for defending the Constitution against threats that hadn't yet emerged. But they would face those challenges with a deeper understanding of their obligations and a stronger commitment to the principles that define their service. As her plane descended toward Indianapolis through the twilight sky, Maggie could see the lights of small towns scattered across the Indiana landscape. Each of those communities represented thousands of American families who were living their lives in freedom because someone had been willing to stand up to government overreach and demand accountability from their elected officials. Margaret O'Sullivan had fulfilled her oath as a Marine, serving with honor and integrity in defense of the Constitution she had sworn to protect. But more importantly, she had helped to ensure that future generations of Americans would inherit a republic that was stronger, more just, and more accountable than the one she had found when she first walked into that chemistry classroom in Millbrook. The work of democracy was never finished, but it was in good hands. The students she had taught, the officers she had influenced, and the citizens who had been inspired by the Millbrook story would carry forward the eternal struggle between power and accountability, between secrecy and transparency, between the abuse of authority and the courage of ordinary people to demand justice. In the end, that was the most important lesson of Millbrook, that democracy was not a system of government, but a way of life requiring the active participation of citizens who understood that freedom was not free, but earned anew by each generation through their willingness to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. In the end, Margaret O'Sullivan did what Marines are trained to do. She held the line. What began as a simple chemistry lesson in small-town Indiana became a revelation that shook the foundations of American democracy. The cost was everything she thought she knew about the country she'd served for 22 years. The gain was something far more precious, the truth. Millbrook lost its innocence but found its soul. Families discovered they were victims but learned they were also survivors. A conspiracy that had operated in the shadows for 4 decades was finally dragged into the light, where lies cannot long endure. Chad Brennan traded his genetic programming for his conscience. Harold Stevenson lived to see his 50-year quest for justice fulfilled. Daughter Eleanor Hartwell's careful documentation became the evidence that brought down a government within the government. But perhaps the greatest victory was this: a generation of students who now understand that democracy is not a spectator sport, that freedom requires vigilance, that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in the quiet classrooms and small towns where American character is forged. The question isn't whether another Millbrook exists somewhere in America today. The question is whether there's another Margaret O'Sullivan, another ordinary citizen, willing to risk everything for an extraordinary truth. What would you do if you discovered the unthinkable in your own community